The airfield was alive with a constant hum. Engines roared, tools clattered, and the wind carried the sharp, acrid scent of oil and metal. It was 1920, and the airmen at RAF Scampton, a remote airbase in the English countryside, were used to the chaotic rhythm of their days. Planes would land and take off at all hours, and between the mechanical whine of engines, the men worked tirelessly to keep them in the air. It was a place that thrived on precision, but beneath that facade of order, there was chaos within the machines and the men who kept them running. Freddie Jackson was a part of this world. He was one of the many mechanics who worked long hours ensuring the safety of the aircraft. Unlike some of his colleagues, who found solace in the repetitive grind of fixing engines, Freddie was restless. His hands were steady, but his mind rarely was. He had a quick smile and a laugh that could brighten the darkest mood, but there were days when the shadows crept into his eyes, as if a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Freddie had always been a bit of a daredevil. Even before he joined the Air Force, he had a reputation for taking risks, sometimes unnecessary ones. He would drink more than he should, stay up long past the point of exhaustion, and push himself beyond his limits. His friends saw it as part of his charm, a kind of reckless bravery that suited a man working in such a dangerous environment. But there was more to it than that. Freddie was running from something, though no one quite knew what. Maybe he didn't know either. In the mess hall, Freddie was a popular figure. He could tell a joke that would have the entire room in stitches, and his easygoing nature meant he had friends in every corner of the base. But when the laughter died down and the long nights settled over the airfield, Freddie would find himself alone, staring at the bottom of a bottle or out into the dark sky, searching for something he couldn't quite name. His comrades never thought much of it. They were all a little rough around the edges, after all. The war had taken its toll on each of them, and everyone had their own way of coping. For some, it was gambling. For others, it was the numbing comfort of drink or the reckless thrill of dangerous stunts. Freddie's self-destructive streak was no secret, but he was good at what he did. No one doubted his skill as a mechanic. He could coax life back into engines that seemed beyond repair, and he had an uncanny knack for knowing when something was wrong just by the sound of a plane's hum. But there were days when Freddie's eyes were red-rimmed, and his hands shook ever so slightly, and his friends would look the other way, pretending not to notice. It was easier that way. "Hey, Freddie, you think you can fix this mess before we have to put it back up there?" called out James, a fellow mechanic, slapping the wing of a biplane that had seen better days. Freddie glanced up from his work, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Course I can," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just keep your hands off it, and we'll be fine." There was laughter, but it was forced, like they were trying to chase away the tension that hung over the airfield like a storm cloud. The airmen lived for these moments of camaraderie. They were a tight-knit group, bound by the shared knowledge that any day could be their last. The aircraft they serviced weren't just machines. They were lifelines, the difference between making it home and not. But the constant pressure wore on them. There were days when Freddie could see it in their eyes, the way they all carried themselves a little more heavily, like they were trudging through an invisible fog. Freddie knew that feeling well. It was there every morning, in the split second after he woke up, but before he remembered where he was. It was a hollow ache that gnawed at him, a feeling that no amount of liquor or laughter could quite chase away. Sometimes he would climb up onto the wing of a plane and just sit there, watching the horizon as the sun dipped below the clouds, the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. It was beautiful, but it also felt like an end, a reminder that everything, even the brightest day, would fade into darkness. One evening, after a long shift, Freddie sat with a few of the guys in the mess hall, nursing a drink. It had been a rough day, with more than one near miss and a lot of frayed nerves. Freddie's laugh was a little louder than usual. his jokes a little sharper, like he was trying to drown out something that only he could hear. "You're gonna drink yourself into an early grave, mate," said Tom, one of the pilots, with a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Freddie just shrugged, tipping his glass back and letting the warmth slide down his throat. "Better than going slow," he said, and there was a moment of silence, heavy and uncomfortable, before someone changed the subject. They all knew what he meant. No one wanted to talk about it, but it was there, unspoken. The understanding that they were all just trying to keep themselves together until the next day. As the night wore on, Freddie slipped out, leaving the noise behind. He wandered the airfield, hands shoved into his pockets, the cold air biting at his skin. He paused by one of the planes, running his fingers along the smooth metal, his breath misting in the dark. He felt a strange kinship with the aircraft, both of them patched up and pushed to their limits, holding together by sheer force of will. Freddie didn't know why he did half the things he did. Maybe it was because he felt like he was always on borrowed time, like there was something chasing him, and if he stopped moving, it would catch up. He wanted to be brave, but there were nights when he was just tired, and all he could do was stand there, staring out at the empty airstrip, feeling like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't see. And so the days passed. The engines roared, the planes flew, and Freddie kept going, one foot in front of the other, holding on to the things that made sense to him. But even then, he could feel it, the cracks starting to show. The way his hands would tremble when he thought no one was looking. The way he would flinch at the sound of a distant explosion, as if the war was still there, lurking in the shadows. In the end, they were all just trying to survive in their own ways. And maybe that was why no one said anything when Freddie took one more drink or stayed out on the airfield a little too long, staring into the dark. They all understood, even if they didn't have the words to say it. The morning of the accident started like any other at the airfield. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, and the ground was still wet with dew as the airmen went about their routines. Engines revved, pilots prepared their flight plans, and the mechanics, including Freddie Jackson, worked to ensure every aircraft was ready to take to the skies. It was a regular day, one that would end up far from ordinary. Freddie hadn't slept much the night before. He had stayed up, drinking and joking with a few friends, trying to shake off the restlessness that had been clinging to him for weeks. When he finally stumbled into bed, he could barely close his eyes without the room spinning around him. He was groggy and irritable, his hands shaky, but he still showed up to work. He always did. The airfield was bustling by the time Freddie arrived. He dragged a hand through his hair, trying to clear his head, and headed to his station. There were planes lined up for routine checks, and he was assigned to inspect one of the newer biplanes. It was a task he could do in his sleep, and most days, it felt like he did. "Morning, Freddie. You look like hell," James greeted, giving him a pat on the back. James's tone was light, but there was concern in his eyes. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Freddie looking worn out. Lately, it seemed like there were more bad days than good ones. Freddie grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, it's my natural state," he joked, picking up his tools and getting to work. "Just keep your eyes on those gauges, and we'll be fine." The morning passed in a blur of noise and motion. Freddie moved from plane to plane, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, and making small adjustments. His hands worked on autopilot, but his mind felt like it was floating somewhere just out of reach. He knew the routine so well that he could almost do it without thinking, but today, there was a creeping sense of unease he couldn't shake. It was around midday when things took a turn. One of the pilots, a young man named Arthur, was preparing for a test flight. The plane had just been serviced, and it was supposed to be a quick routine check. Freddie had been one of the last to work on it, and he had given it the all clear. As Arthur climbed into the cockpit, Freddy caught sight of him and gave a thumbs up, a casual sign of reassurance. But his smile faded as soon as the plane began to taxi down the runway. The engine stuttered, coughed, and then roared to life. For a moment, everything seemed fine. But then, without warning, the plane veered to one side, the nose dipping dangerously. Freddy's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a cold, creeping dread wash over him as he watched. He knew something was wrong, but he couldn't understand what. Arthur tried to correct the plane, but it was too late. The biplane jerked and twisted, the wings catching the ground as it skidded, flipping over in a sickening slow-motion roll. The sound of metal crunching and the deafening roar of the crash echoed across the airfield. Freddy felt frozen, his feet rooted to the spot as he watched the disaster unfold in front of him. Shouts filled the air, and people started running toward the wreckage. Freddy was one of the first to move, sprinting across the field, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He could smell the smoke, sharp and acrid, burning the back of his throat. He didn't care. He just had to get there, had to do something. When he reached the plane, it was already clear that it was bad. The cockpit was a mangled mess of metal and shattered glass, and Arthur was slumped over, unmoving. Freddy's hands shook as he tried to pull the twisted frame apart, desperate to reach him. "Come on, Arthur, stay with me," he muttered under his breath, his voice choked with panic. But there was nothing he could do. The medics arrived within minutes, pulling Freddy away as they worked to free Arthur. Freddy stood there, helpless, his clothes smeared with oil and dirt, his hands trembling. He watched as they lifted Arthur's limp body out of the wreckage, his face pale, his uniform stained with blood. There was no need to say it out loud. The silence that followed spoke volumes. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The airfield, normally so full of life, felt hollow, as if the crash had sucked all the air out of it. The men gathered in small, quiet groups, whispering and glancing over at the twisted wreckage, still lying on the runway like a dark stain. Freddy stayed close to the hangar, away from the others. He didn't want to hear the whispers or see the pity in their eyes. He kept replaying the morning over and over in his head, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Had he missed something? Was there a mistake he didn't catch? The questions gnawed at him, relentless and cruel. He was a good mechanic. He prided himself on that. But now, all he could think about was the look on Arthur's face, the way he had smiled just before he climbed into the cockpit. "Freddy, it's not your fault," James said quietly, coming up beside him. "These things happen. Sometimes it's just bad luck." Freddy clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "No," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I should have known. I should have seen it." He didn't know what he was supposed to have seen, but it didn't matter. The guilt was like a weight, crushing his chest, making it hard to breathe. That night, Freddy found himself alone again, but this time, the silence felt unbearable. He didn't go to the mess hall. He couldn't face the others, couldn't bear to see their faces, knowing they were thinking about the same thing he was. Instead, he wandered out to the edge of the airfield, a bottle in hand, the cold night air biting at his skin. He drank and drank, but the numbness he was searching for never quite came. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see the crash, hear the screech of metal, and the shouts echoing in his ears. The bottle slipped from his grasp, shattering on the ground, and he sank to his knees, his hands shaking so badly he could barely keep them still. There was no way to escape it. The guilt, the fear, the sickening feeling that he had let everyone down, it all swirled around him, closing in like a vice. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out, just a strangled gasp that got lost in the wind. He didn't know how long he stayed there, crumpled on the ground, but when he finally looked up, the sky was dark, the stars glinting coldly above him. For the first time, Freddy realized he was afraid, not just of what had happened, but of what might happen next. He had always prided himself on being able to handle anything, but now he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into a void that he couldn't pull himself back from. The next morning, Freddy showed up to work, but it was like he was moving through a fog. The airfield seemed quieter than usual, the men subdued, their faces drawn and tired. There was no laughter, no easy banter, just the grim, heavy silence that followed in the wake of tragedy. And for Freddy, that silence was worse than anything else, because in that silence, there was nowhere to hide from the truth. Something had broken, and he didn't know how to fix it. The weeks after the crash were a blur. The airfield, usually bustling with noise and life, had settled into a somber rhythm. The men went about their duties with a sense of quiet determination, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones. The wreckage had long been cleared, but the memory of what happened still lingered like a dark cloud over the base. Freddie Jackson was still there, but he wasn't really there. He moved through his days mechanically, his mind somewhere else, his eyes haunted. Everyone at the airfield knew that Freddie had taken Arthur's death hard. Most of them had lost friends before. It was part of the job, but this was different. Freddie hadn't just lost a friend. He felt like he had failed one. And no matter how many times people tried to tell him it wasn't his fault, he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have done something, seen something, that would have changed everything. Freddie's nights became a series of long, solitary walks around the airfield, usually with a bottle hidden in his jacket. He would sit on the wing of an old plane, staring out into the darkness, letting the cold seep into his skin until he felt numb. The alcohol helped dull the edges of his thoughts, but it never silenced them completely. He was spiraling, and he knew it, but he couldn't figure out how to stop. The emptiness was always there, gnawing at him, no matter how hard he tried to fill it. It was on one of those nights that James approached him. Freddie hadn't seen him coming, and when James sat down beside him on the wing, Freddie nearly dropped his bottle. "You're gonna catch your death out here," James said, his voice gentle but firm. He didn't look at Freddie, just stared out into the dark, his hands shoved into his pockets. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Freddie laughed, but it was a hollow, brittle sound. "What am I supposed to do then? Pretend everything's fine?" "Because it's not." James didn't respond right away. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of a generator and the occasional rustle of wind. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We're taking a group photo tomorrow. For the squadron. Thought you might want to be there." Freddie hesitated. It felt wrong. The idea of standing in front of a camera, smiling, as if everything was back to normal. But there was something in James's tone, a quiet insistence, that made it hard to say no. "I'll think about it," he said, which was the closest he could come to agreeing. The next day dawned gray and overcast, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. The mood around the airfield was subdued, as if the weather had seeped into everyone's bones. When Freddie showed up at the hangar, he was surprised to see how many of the men were already there, dressed in their uniforms, trying to smooth out their jackets and straighten their caps. For a moment, it felt like things were almost normal again, like they were just a group of friends getting ready to have their picture taken, rather than a team struggling to hold themselves together. The photographer, an older man with a thick mustache and a gruff manner, barked orders at the men, directing them into place. "Stand straight, look sharp. We're not here to waste time," he said, snapping his fingers at anyone who moved too slowly. Freddie found himself near the back, squeezed between James and another mechanic named Tom. He felt out of place, like he was watching the whole thing from a distance. "Smile, Freddie," James said, nudging him with his elbow. "It won't kill you." Freddie forced a grin, though it felt more like a grimace. The photographer raised his camera, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then there was a flash, a click, and it was over. The men broke apart, talking and laughing as they headed back to their duties, the moment already fading from memory. Freddie lingered, watching them go, feeling an odd sense of disconnection. He hadn't realized how much he missed that sound, the easy banter, the jokes. It made him ache because it reminded him of how things used to be before everything went wrong. A few days later, the photograph arrived. The photographer had developed it quickly, and a small group gathered around to take a look. It was a decent shot, considering the conditions. The men were standing in neat rows, their uniforms crisp, their faces solemn but not without a hint of a smile. James spotted Freddie and waved him over. "Here it is," James said, holding up the photograph. "We don't look half bad, do we?" Freddie took the picture, glancing over it without much interest. But as his eyes scanned the rows of faces, he felt his heart stop. There, standing at the edge of the group, almost hidden in the shadow of the hangar, was a face he recognized all too well. It was Arthur. Freddie blinked, convinced he was imagining things. He looked again, harder this time, but the face didn't disappear. It was Arthur, staring straight at the camera, his expression calm and steady, as if he had never been gone at all. The room was suddenly too bright, the air too thin. Freddie stumbled back, nearly dropping the photograph. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. That's impossible." "What's impossible?" James asked, frowning. "Freddie, what's wrong?" Freddie shoved the photograph into James's hands, his fingers shaking. "Look," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Tell me you see it too." James studied the picture, his brow furrowing. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Freddie thought he was going to dismiss it, tell him he was imagining things. But then James's eyes widened, and he looked up, his face pale. "How?" He started, but he didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was seeing. Word spread quickly across the airfield. Men who hadn't been interested in the photograph before were suddenly clamoring to see it, passing it around with a mix of awe and unease. Some tried to laugh it off, calling it a trick of the light, a flaw in the film. But others weren't so sure. They had known Arthur, had seen him smiling and joking just like everyone else. They had mourned him. And now, there he was, staring back at them from a photograph that shouldn't have been able to capture him. Freddie felt like he was losing his grip on reality. He had been struggling to hold himself together ever since the crash, but this was too much. He wanted to believe it was just a mistake, that there was some logical explanation. But every time he looked at the photograph, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if someone was walking over his grave. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, mostly to himself. "He's gone. I saw it. We all did." James placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression grim. "Maybe he's trying to tell us something." The words sent a shiver through Freddie. "Tell us what?" he asked, but James just shook his head. He didn't have an answer, and neither did anyone else. The photograph was a mystery, one that none of them could explain. It felt like a message, but no one knew what it was supposed to mean. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the airfield grew tense. The photograph was pinned up in the mess hall, where anyone could see it, and every time Freddie walked past, he felt a knot tighten in his chest. The men started to whisper, not just about the photograph, but about the strange things that had been happening since the crash, the tools that went missing, only to turn up in odd places, the flicker of shadows where there shouldn't have been any, the feeling that they were being watched. Freddie didn't want to believe in ghosts, but late at night, when he was alone and the air was still, he could feel something pressing in around him, heavy and suffocating. He thought about Arthur, about the way he had looked in the photograph, and he wondered if maybe James was right. Maybe Arthur was trying to tell them something. Or maybe, Freddie thought, his mind darkening, it was something worse. Maybe it was a warning. The airfield was no longer the familiar, bustling place it had once been. Since the photograph appeared, a suffocating tension seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy, making it hard for the men to go about their routines. Conversations that used to be filled with laughter had turned quiet, filled with nervous glances and uneasy murmurs. No one spoke about the photograph outright, but it was on everyone's mind. Freddie could see it in their faces, in the way they moved, cautious and alert, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. Freddie himself was barely holding it together. He had stopped trying to convince himself that everything was fine, because it clearly wasn't. Every day felt like he was walking through a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. And every time he saw Arthur's face in that photograph, he felt a chill seep into his bones. It wasn't just the image of his dead friend that haunted him. It was the feeling that Arthur was still there, somewhere, watching. The strange occurrences that had begun after the crash were becoming harder to ignore. At first, it had been small things. The misplaced tools, the flickering lights, the occasional murmur of voices when no one else was around. But as the days passed, the incidents grew more unsettling. One evening, Freddie was working late in the hangar, trying to lose himself in the monotony of fixing an engine. The hangar was quiet. The only sounds the soft clink of metal and the hum of machinery. But then he heard a faint whisper, just behind his ear. He spun around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was no one. Just the empty, dimly lit hangar, shadows stretching across the floor. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was just tired. But then it happened again, a low, indistinct murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. This time, he didn't turn around. He just closed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing, willing the whisper to stop. But it didn't. Instead, it grew louder, more insistent, until he could almost make out words. His hands began to shake, and he dropped his wrench, the clatter echoing through the empty space. He wanted to run, but his feet felt glued to the spot. It wasn't until he heard a loud bang, like something falling, that he finally snapped out of it and bolted for the door, his heart pounding. Outside, the cool night air hit his face, sharp and biting, and he took a deep, shaky breath. He stood there for a moment, trying to steady himself before looking back at the hangar. Nothing seemed out of place, but he could still feel the whispering, like it was lingering just out of reach. He didn't go back inside. Instead, he headed straight for his bunk, where he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The next morning, Freddie didn't mention what had happened. He didn't want to talk about it. Didn't want to admit that he was starting to crack. But when he showed up for roll call, he could see that he wasn't the only one on edge. James, who was usually so upbeat, looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. Tom, another mechanic, was fidgeting with his hands, his gaze darting around nervously. It was as if the whole squadron was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That day, they had a maintenance check on one of the old biplanes. It was a simple task, one they had done hundreds of times before. But as Freddie climbed into the cockpit to check the controls, he felt a jolt of unease. The seat was cold, colder than it should have been, and for a moment, he felt like he was sitting in someone else's place. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But when he reached for the throttle, his hand froze. There, etched faintly into the metal, were the initials, a J. Freddie's breath caught in his throat. Arthur Jameson. Arthur's initials. He stared at them, unblinking, his mind struggling to make sense of it. The letters were faint, almost worn away, like they had been there for years. But he knew they hadn't been. He would have seen them before. Freddie jumped out of the cockpit, his hands clammy, and rushed to find James. When he found him, he didn't even bother with a greeting. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tight with urgency. James followed him back to the plane, his expression puzzled. But when he saw the initials, His confusion turned to alarm. "Do you think?" James began, but he didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was asking. Freddy didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. All he could think about was the photograph, the whispering, and now this. It felt like the air around them was closing in, suffocating. He wanted to believe there was a rational explanation, that someone was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, he was beginning to suspect the truth was far more terrifying. The rumors spread fast. By the end of the day, everyone on the base had heard about the initials. Some of the men tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a coincidence, but their laughter sounded forced, hollow. Others started avoiding the hangar altogether, as if they could feel the same creeping unease that Freddy did. And then there were those who began to whisper, not just about Arthur, but about ghosts. Freddy hated that word. It made everything feel more real, more impossible to ignore. But the signs were everywhere, and they were getting harder to dismiss. One night, he was lying in his bunk, staring at the photograph that someone had left on his bedside table. He didn't know who had put it there, and he didn't want to know. He was about to turn off the light when he heard a sound, soft and rhythmic like footsteps. He sat up, his heart thudding in his chest, and listened. The footsteps were faint, almost like someone walking on tiptoe. They moved down the hallway, slow and deliberate, stopping right outside his door. Freddy held his breath, waiting for them to move on, but they didn't. They just stood there, silent, like they were waiting for him to do something. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, but he could feel a presence, heavy and cold, pressing against the door. He stayed like that for what felt like hours, his eyes fixed on the handle, half expecting it to turn. But it never did. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance, leaving him alone in the dark. Freddy didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he found James and told him everything, the whispers, the initials, the footsteps. He expected James to tell him he was overreacting, that he needed to get some rest. But instead, James just nodded, his expression grim. "You're not the only one, Freddy," he said quietly. "Others have been hearing things too, seeing things." It was the confirmation Freddy had been dreading. He had been hoping, even praying, that it was all in his head, that he was just losing it. But if other people were experiencing the same thing, then it was real. And if it was real, then there was no escaping it. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker. More men began reporting strange occurrences, doors that creaked open on their own, tools that vanished without a trace, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some of them even claimed to have seen Arthur, standing at the edge of the airfield, watching them. Freddy wanted to tell them they were imagining things, but he couldn't bring himself to say it, because he had seen it too. One night, after another restless, sleepless evening, Freddy found himself back in the hangar, staring at the photograph pinned to the wall. He didn't know why he kept coming back to it, why he couldn't just let it go. Maybe he was looking for answers, or maybe he was just waiting for something to change. But as he stood there, staring at Arthur's face, he felt a strange sense of calm, as if everything was finally starting to make sense. Maybe Arthur was trying to reach out, to say something that he hadn't been able to say before. Or maybe he was stuck, trapped between this world and the next, unable to move on. Freddy didn't know, but he could feel the pull, the invisible thread that connected them, and he knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. As he turned to leave, he heard a whisper, soft and clear, cutting through the stillness of the hangar. "Freddy." It was Arthur's voice, unmistakable, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't turn around. He just stood there, frozen, as the voice whispered again, more insistent this time. "Freddy, help me." For the first time in weeks, Freddy felt a glimmer of hope. If Arthur was trying to communicate, then maybe he could figure out what he wanted. maybe he could help him find peace. But even as he clung to that hope, a part of him knew that whatever was happening was far from over. It was just beginning, and he was standing right at the center of it. The airfield had become a place of restless, unspoken fears. The men moved like ghosts themselves, avoiding the hangar, the photograph, and, most of all, Freddie. They could sense something different about him, something heavy and unsettling, like he was carrying a burden they couldn't see. He was still showing up for work, still going through the motions, but there was a hollowness in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a kind of quiet desperation that set him apart from the others. Freddie had spent sleepless nights trying to piece together what was happening. The whispers, the initials on the plane, the footsteps, each event felt like part of a larger puzzle, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't see the full picture. He knew Arthur was trying to communicate with him. He could feel it, a presence that lingered just at the edge of his consciousness, pulling him closer, urging him to listen. But the more he tried to understand, the more confused he became. The base was no longer just a workplace. It was a labyrinth of shadows and echoes, and Freddie felt like he was lost somewhere in the middle, unable to find his way out. Every night, he would return to the hangar, staring at the photograph, waiting for the whispers to come. He didn't know what he was expecting, maybe another message, maybe a sign. But each time he heard Arthur's voice, it was the same, repeating that same plea. Help me. As the days went on, the strange occurrences only escalated. The whispers became more frequent, no longer confined to the quiet of the night. Men began reporting cold spots, sudden drafts of icy air that seemed to come out of nowhere, sending shivers down their spines even in the middle of summer. Tools would disappear, only to reappear in places they had no reason to be, like the mess hall or the barracks. And then there were the sightings' fleeting glimpses of a figure, standing just at the edge of the runway, barely visible in the fading light. Freddie wasn't the only one who saw him. Others had started to see Arthur, too, and the stories spread quickly, each one more unnerving than the last. Some said they had seen him standing by the hangar, his uniform neat, his face calm, like he was waiting for something. Others claimed to have seen him in the barracks, sitting on an empty bunk, staring at the wall. But every account had one thing in common, the look in Arthur's eyes. A look of sadness, of longing, as if he was searching for something he couldn't find. James was the first to confront Freddie about it. One evening, after another long, grueling day, he found Freddie in the hangar, staring at the photograph, the same way he had been every night for weeks. James approached him cautiously, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile hold Freddie had on reality. "Freddie," James said, his voice soft but firm, "you need to stop this. Whatever's happening, it's not your fault. You can't keep torturing yourself like this." Freddie didn't look at him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Arthur is trying to tell me something. He needs my help." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're not making sense. Arthur's gone, Freddie. Whatever you think you're hearing, it's not real. You need to let it go." Freddie turned to face him, and for a moment, James recoiled at the intensity in his eyes. "You think I want to believe this?" Freddie snapped, his voice cracking with frustration. "You think I want to spend every night listening to whispers in the dark, wondering if I'm losing my mind? But I'm telling you, it's real. I've heard him. I've seen him." James hesitated, torn between wanting to comfort his friend and the fear that there was nothing he could say to make things better. "Even if it is real, what are you going to do?" he asked quietly. "You can't bring him back." Freddie didn't answer. He just looked back at the photograph, his eyes distant, lost. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I have to try. I can't keep living like this." That night, Freddie made up his mind. He didn't know how, but he was going to find a way to reach Arthur, to figure out what he was trying to say. He couldn't keep running from it. couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal. Because it wasn't, and it never would be until he found a way to understand what was happening. He waited until the base had quieted down, until most of the men had gone to bed. Then he slipped out of his bunk, making his way to the hangar with a flashlight in hand. The air was cool and the sky was clear, a sharp contrast to the darkness that seemed to have settled over the airfield. As he approached the hangar, he could feel his heart begin to race, his pulse pounding in his ears, but he didn't stop. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to turn back now. Inside, the hangar was dark and silent, the only light coming from the faint glow of his flashlight. He made his way to the old biplane, the one with Arthur's initials, and climbed into the cockpit. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, but as he sat there, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him, as if he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice echoing in the stillness. "If you're here, if you can hear me, I'm listening." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, the air around him began to change. It was subtle at first, a faint chill that prickled his skin, but it grew stronger, sharper, until it felt like he was standing in the middle of a freezing wind. And then he heard it a whisper, so soft he almost missed it, but unmistakable. "Freddy." He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the hangar, but there was no one there. "I'm here, Arthur," he said, louder this time, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "What do you want me to do?" The whisper came again, clearer this time, and Freddy felt a shiver run down his spine. "I need you to remember." "Remember what?" Freddy asked, his voice rising with frustration. "I don't understand." "Please, just tell me." The hangar seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening, and for a moment, Freddy thought he saw something move out of the corner of his eye, a figure, standing just at the edge of the light. He swung the flashlight around, and there, barely visible in the darkness, was Arthur. He looked exactly as he had in life, his uniform crisp, his cap tilted at a slight angle, his face calm. But there was something different about him now, something sad and distant, as if he was struggling to hold on to whatever was keeping him there. Freddy felt his throat tighten. "Arthur," he whispered. "What happened? Why are you still here?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He just looked at Freddy, his eyes filled with an emotion that was impossible to read. And then, slowly, he raised his hand, pointing to the biplane, to the initials etched into the metal. "Remember," he said, his voice barely more than a sigh, "it wasn't your fault." Freddy blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't." Before he could finish, the hangar was filled with a loud, echoing bang, like the sound of an engine misfiring. Freddy flinched, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. When he looked up, Arthur was gone, the darkness swallowing him whole. Freddy stumbled out of the cockpit, his hands trembling, his mind reeling. It wasn't his fault. That's what Arthur had said. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Something he was missing, something Arthur was trying to show him. And as he stood there, alone in the dark, he realized he couldn't do this by himself. He needed help. The next morning, Freddy went to James. He told him everything, from the whispers to the sighting in the hangar, and for the first time, James didn't try to dismiss it. He listened, his expression serious, and when Freddy was done, he nodded. "If Arthur's trying to reach out, then maybe we need to find a way to reach back," James said. "But we're not going to do it alone. Whatever's happening, we're going to face it together." It was the first time in weeks that Freddy felt a flicker of hope. He didn't know what lay ahead, or if they would ever get the answers they were looking for. But at least now, he wasn't alone. And as they stood there, staring at the photograph pinned to the wall, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, they were finally getting closer to the truth. Whatever had kept Arthur tethered to this place, whatever message he was trying to deliver, Freddy was determined to uncover it. And this time, he wasn't going to run. The Bell family lived a quiet and peaceful life in the rural countryside of Adams, Tennessee, in the early 19th century. John Bell, the patriarch, was a well-respected farmer who had moved to the area with his wife, Lucy, and their children, hoping to build a prosperous and serene life. Their farmhouse, nestled among sprawling fields and towering trees, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Little did they know, something far darker lurked beneath the calm surface of their lives. It was in 1817 when strange things began to occur on the Bell property. At first, the signs were subtle and easy to dismiss. John would occasionally see odd animals wandering near the edges of his fields, creatures he couldn't quite identify, their forms shifting and unnatural. He spotted what looked like a large dog with a rabbit's head, and another time, a bird too large for the region perched in a tree. These sightings left him uneasy, but he chalked them up to tricks of the mind, refusing to believe anything was truly wrong. Soon, however, the strange events escalated beyond harmless wildlife. The first real sign of trouble came when John Bell began hearing odd sounds around the farmhouse. At night, the walls creaked and groaned in ways that didn't seem natural, like the wood itself was trying to speak. The noise of knocking echoed through the rooms, and sometimes it seemed like chains were being dragged across the floor, though nothing was ever found out of place. It wasn't long before the rest of the family began to notice these sounds as well. The Bell children, especially young Betsy, started waking up terrified, claiming they heard faint whispering in their ears while they slept. Lucy Bell, though skeptical at first, could no longer deny that something was very wrong when she too began hearing unexplained sounds, as though someone or something was watching them from just beyond their sight. One evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, a loud, sharp knock came from the front door. John, thinking it might be a late visitor or a neighbor in need, got up to answer it, only to find no one there. The knock came again, this time from the back door. But once again, there was no one in sight. The third knock came from inside the house itself. The family sat frozen in fear, unable to explain how this could be happening. They had begun to realize that something far more sinister than a prank was at play. Over the next few days, the haunting sounds grew louder and more frequent. It was as though the house had come alive with a presence that couldn't be seen, but was undeniably there. The walls echoed with strange voices, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and footsteps could be heard pacing through empty rooms. Yet, whenever the family tried to investigate, they found nothing. It was as though an invisible force had taken up residence in their home, and it wasn't going to leave anytime soon. John Bell, being a man of faith and reason, sought to keep his family calm, reassuring them that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the wind or some natural phenomena, but deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no amount of reason could explain away the growing terror they felt each night. Despite his outward calm, he couldn't shake the creeping fear that this presence had come for him. Specifically, the once tranquil Bell home had become a place of dread. No longer able to ignore the strange happenings, John confided in a close neighbor, seeking advice on what to do. But the neighbor had no solutions. Word began to spread in the small community that the Bell family was experiencing something otherworldly, though few believed it at first. After all, who would believe that a house could be haunted by something invisible, something so relentless and violent? The days passed, but the entity showed no sign of leaving. The family could no longer sleep through the night, as the knocking, the scratching sounds, and the heavy footsteps never ceased. It was as if the entity wanted them to know it was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding, waiting for something darker yet to come. As the weeks wore on, the Bell family found themselves slipping into a state of constant fear and exhaustion. They had no idea what the entity wanted, but they knew it wasn't going to leave on its own. Whatever this presence was, it had taken root in their home, and they were helpless to stop it. The Bell Witch had arrived, and the nightmare was only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family's quiet farmhouse became a place of escalating fear and confusion. What had begun as strange noises and eerie disturbances quickly transformed into something far more aggressive. It seemed the entity, whatever it was growing stronger. No longer content with simply haunting the house, it began to physically target the family, with a particular focus on John Bell and his young daughter, Betsy. The first signs of the entity's more dangerous nature emerged when Betsy started to experience strange sensations at night. At first, it felt like gentle taps on her skin, like someone lightly flicking her arm. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was nothing more than her imagination. But soon, these sensations grew into something much more alarming. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of her hair being yanked, her bed covers ripped off, or an invisible hand slapping her face. These attacks left her terrified and helpless, but they were just the beginning. As Betsy's torment grew, so did the malevolent presence in the house. Objects that once sat quietly on shelves would now fly across the room without warning, smashing into walls or crashing to the floor. Chairs would tip over by themselves, and dishes would shatter for no apparent reason. The invisible force seemed to revel in causing chaos, as if it found joy in making the Bell family live in constant fear. John Bell, too, was not spared from the entity's wrath. One morning, as he was working in the fields, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his face, as though he had been struck by an unseen hand. He stumbled, clutching his cheek, but when he looked around, there was no one there. This mysterious attack repeated itself several times over the coming weeks. John would be walking through his home or tending to his land when, without warning, he would feel the sting of an invisible force hitting him. Sometimes it was a slap, other times a violent push that nearly knocked him off his feet. The relentless torment began to take its toll on the entire family. Betsy, once a bright and lively girl, became withdrawn and fearful. She spent her days in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next attack would come. Her schoolwork suffered, and she became too frightened to sleep alone at night, often seeking comfort in her parents' room. The stress weighed heavily on John and Lucy Bell as well, as they watched their daughter suffer and felt powerless to stop it. Despite their growing desperation, the Bell family tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. They continued their daily routines, farming, cooking, and tending to the household, hoping that by ignoring the entity, it might go away. But the more they ignored it, the more aggressive it seemed to become. The Bell children, especially Betsy, were often targeted while they slept. On one particularly terrifying night, Betsy awoke to find herself being lifted from her bed by an unseen force. She screamed in terror, and her parents rushed to her room, only to find her suspended in midair, her body thrashing as if being held by an invisible grip. As soon as John and Lucy entered the room, Betsy was dropped back onto her bed, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. There was no explanation for what had just happened, no way to rationalize the nightmare their daughter was living through. The attacks didn't stop with Betsy. Other members of the household also began experiencing physical assaults. Knocks and slaps came out of nowhere, leaving bruises and welts on their skin. The Bell family soon realized that they were dealing with a force beyond their understanding, one that was not only malicious, but intelligent. It seemed to know exactly when and how to strike, always leaving them on edge, waiting for the next act of violence. Word of the Bell family's plight began to spread throughout the community. Neighbors who visited the house witnessed the strange occurrences for themselves, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and the eerie sounds of whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some locals believed the family had fallen victim to a powerful curse, while others thought they were dealing with an angry spirit seeking revenge for some past wrong. As the entity's attacks grew more frequent and more violent, the family became desperate for answers. John Bell turned to friends and neighbors for help, hoping that someone might know how to rid their home of the invisible force. But no one had any solutions. Ministers and pastors were called in to pray over the house, but even their spiritual guidance couldn't stop the torment. The Bell family began to lose hope, feeling as though they were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The Bell Witch, as the entity had now come to be called, was relentless. It seemed to feed off the family's fear and suffering, growing more powerful with each passing day. John Bell, in particular, seemed to be the primary target. His health began to deteriorate as the constant stress and fear took a toll on his body. His once strong frame became frail, and his hands shook with anxiety. It was clear that the entity wanted something, but what it wanted remained a mystery. Despite the family's efforts to resist, they were losing their battle against the unseen force. The Bell Witch had made its intentions clear. It wasn't going to leave until it had finished whatever dark mission it had come to carry out. And as the attacks on Betsy and John grew more intense, the family couldn't help but wonder if they would survive the ordeal. The torment had already reached unbearable heights for the Bell family, but they were about to discover that the entity haunting their home was far more terrifying than they ever imagined. What had begun as an invisible, violent presence soon revealed itself to be something that could speak, something that could communicate with chilling clarity. It wasn't just a ghost or some mindless force. It was intelligent, cunning, and it had a voice. The first time the entity spoke, it caught the family completely off guard. They had grown used to the eerie knocks, disembodied footsteps, and the unsettling physical attacks. But when the family was sitting quietly one evening, bracing themselves for whatever might come next, a voice filled the room cold, clear, and unmistakably human. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. "I am here for John Bell," the voice said plainly. The family froze, staring at one another in disbelief. Was this some kind of cruel trick? But no, they all heard it. John Bell's face drained of color. Whatever this thing was, it had just declared that it was targeting him specifically. The air in the room seemed to thicken with dread as the voice continued, sometimes mocking, sometimes angry, but always clear in its hatred for John. The entity called itself Kate, though it later became widely known as the Bell Witch, and it made no secret of its intentions. The voice was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. It wasn't just random murmurs or whispers. It spoke in full sentences, as if it were a living person. It would ask questions, make demands, and even hold conversations with the family and their visitors. What made it even more terrifying was its depth of knowledge. Kate seemed to know things about the Bell family and their neighbors, secrets, events, and details that no one outside the family could have known. It could describe what was happening in other parts of town as if it had been there itself, watching and listening. The voice also seemed to enjoy tormenting Betsy. It would call her name in the dead of night, whisper cruel things in her ear, and laugh whenever she cried out in fear. It wasn't just content with physical attacks anymore. It wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel hopeless and afraid. The once bright and happy child was now a shadow of herself, living in constant fear of when the voice would speak again, what it would say, and what it would do. John Bell was another favorite target of the witch. Kate often berated him, insulting him, and claiming that it had come to end his life. It was as though the entity had a personal vendetta against him. The reasons were never entirely clear, though rumors swirled that Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John had a falling out over a land deal, had cursed the Bell family out of spite. Whether or not this was true didn't seem to matter. The entity that called itself Kate seemed determined to fulfill its promise. The Bell family's friends and neighbors were initially skeptical of their claims about a talking spirit. But that changed quickly when word spread of the strange occurrences, and people began visiting the Bell household themselves to hear the voice. Ministers, curious locals, and even travelers from neighboring counties came to witness the phenomenon, and none left without being thoroughly shaken by what they experienced. The witch, it seemed, enjoyed the attention, often showing off its knowledge of distant events or entertaining visitors by speaking in different voices and tones. It could imitate the voice of anyone it chose. Sometimes it would even mimic the voices of the family themselves, causing confusion and fear. As the entity continued to speak, it became clear that this was more than just a haunting. It was something far more dangerous. The witch took pleasure in manipulating those around it, bending their will through fear, and taunting them with its knowledge and power. The Bell family tried to get help from local ministers, hoping that religious intervention might drive the entity away, but nothing worked. The prayers, the exorcisms, the blessings on the house, none of it made any difference. The voice persisted, as powerful and menacing as ever. And with each passing day, the witch's focus on John Bell grew more intense. It would mock him relentlessly, whispering threats and insults while he went about his daily life. His health, already fragile from the stress of living under such torment, began to deteriorate further. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find himself unable to move, his limbs heavy as though held down by an invisible force. He started suffering from unexplained seizures, his once strong and commanding presence reduced to that of a sickly and terrified man. Despite the terror it inflicted, the Bell Witch's voice wasn't always violent. It had moments of disturbing calm where it would engage in conversations, sometimes even laughing and joking with visitors. It seemed to enjoy playing with people's emotions, luring them into a false sense of security before turning on them with renewed ferocity. The voice was always unpredictable. One moment, it would be soft and friendly, and the next it would erupt in anger, hurling insults or making sinister threats. The most chilling aspect of the witch's communication was its promise. It had come to take John Bell's life, and it wouldn't stop until it had succeeded. The family was trapped in their own home, with no means of escape from the torment that had invaded every corner of their lives. Each day brought them closer to the grim reality that the witch might indeed be able to carry out its threat. By now, the Bell Witch was not just a local legend, but a phenomenon that had captured the attention of people far and wide. Visitors continued to flock to the Bell farm, seeking answers or hoping to experience the haunting for themselves. But for John Bell and his family, this was no spectacle. It was a living nightmare, and they were all too aware that the witch's promises were not idle threats. The Bell family had now come to understand the true nature of the entity they were dealing with. It wasn't just haunting them, it was targeting them, manipulating them, and working toward a single, terrifying goal. And as John Bell's health worsened, the family could only wait in dread, knowing that the worst was yet to come. As the witch's torment grew more relentless, it became clear that John Bell's days were numbered. The entity that had come to be known as the Bell Witch had made its intentions known from the start. It was determined to take John Bell's life, and now it seemed ready to fulfill that dark promise. Despite the Bell family's efforts to protect him, John's health was rapidly deteriorating, and there was little they could do to stop it. By late 1820, John had become a shadow of his former self. Once a strong and respected farmer, he was now a frail, weak man who could barely leave his bed. The constant stress and fear had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally, and the witch seemed to take delight in watching him waste away. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he struggled to speak or even move at times. The witch's attacks had become more personal, more direct, and more vicious as the weeks wore on. Each day brought new torments, The witch, with its unnerving voice, would whisper cruel taunts in John's ear, reminding him of its power over him. "Your time is near, John Bell," it would say, filling the room with a dark, ominous energy. Sometimes the voice would mock his weakness, laughing at his failing body, while other times it would grow angry. One evening, threatened as the Bell family gathered in John's room, the witch's presence, the family could only watch in horror as John's condition worsened, thick and suffocating. John lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. He had been bedridden for days, and the once vibrant man was now barely recognizable. The room was tense with dread as the witch's voice filled the space again, speaking in low, menacing tones. It declared once more that it had come to end John's life, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The following morning, on December 20th, 1820, John Bell did not wake. Lucy, his wife, was the first to find him lying still in his bed. His breathing had become so faint that, at first, it seemed like he might still be alive. But as she approached, it became clear that he was slipping away. She called for the children, and soon the entire family gathered by John's side, praying for a miracle that would never come. In the midst of their grief, the witch's voice rang out again, cold and triumphant. "I did it. I finished what I came to do." The words hung heavy in the air, and the family was left in stunned silence. The witch had claimed responsibility for John Bell's death, just as it had promised it would. There was no mistaking it now. The entity had carried out its grim mission. The cause of John's sudden decline and death had remained a mystery, but in the days following his passing, the family discovered something chilling. Among John's medicine bottles, they found one that contained a strange, unidentified liquid. No one in the family recognized it, and it hadn't been prescribed by the doctor. Desperate for answers, they tested the substance by giving a small amount to the family's cat. Tragically, the animal didn't survive for long after consuming the liquid, confirming the family's worst fears. This mysterious substance had likely been used to poison John Bell. When confronted with this discovery, the witch's voice erupted in gleeful laughter. "I gave him that potion," it proclaimed, reveling in its victory. There was no longer any doubt that the Bell Witch had been responsible for John's death, using the strange liquid to carry out its fatal plan. It was a devastating realization for the Bell family, who had fought so hard to protect John, only to lose him to the very force they had feared for so long. As the Bell family prepared for John's funeral, the witch continued its disturbing behavior. During the solemn event, while friends and neighbors gathered to pay their respects, the entity made its presence known in a horrifying display. The witch's voice interrupted the proceedings, mocking the mourners, laughing loudly, and making crude jokes at the expense of the grieving family. It was a final, cruel insult, adding a layer of humiliation to the pain and sorrow of John Bell's passing. The family was left devastated, unable to escape the reach of the entity, even in their time of mourning. The death of John Bell marked the culmination of the witch's campaign of terror. For years, the Bell family had endured unimaginable horrors, but now the entity had accomplished what it had set out to do from the very beginning. It had taken John's life, and it had done so with a sense of satisfaction and malicious pride. The family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, unsure of what would happen next. Yet, as dark as things had become, the witch's influence over the Bell household began to wane after John's death. The violent attacks on Betsy grew less frequent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the farm seemed to lift, if only slightly. The entity, it seemed, had fulfilled its purpose, and with John gone, its presence started to fade. Despite the diminishing torment, the Bell family could never truly move on from what had happened. The memory of John's suffering and the witch's cruel laughter haunted them, even as the physical manifestations of the haunting began to dissipate. For the Bell children, especially Betsy, the scars of those years would last a lifetime. John Bell's death left a mark not only on his family, but on the entire community. The story of the Bell Witch spread far beyond Adams, Tennessee, becoming a legend that would be passed down for generations. People from all over the country would hear the tale of the haunting of the vengeful witch who had taken the life of a man without ever being seen. Though the entity seemed to have accomplished its goal, the question of why it had chosen John Bell and what truly fueled its hatred remained a mystery, one that would linger long after the haunting had ended. In the wake of John Bell's death, the Bell family hoped that the terror that had gripped their home for so many years might finally be over. The Bell Witch, after all, had achieved its dark purpose. It had taken John's life, just as it had promised, and for a while, it seemed that the entity might finally leave them in peace. The violent attacks on Betsy subsided, and the eerie disturbances that had plagued their home began to fade. But even though the immediate threat had diminished, the shadow of the Bell Witch still loomed over the family, the farm, and the entire community. In the months following John Bell's death, the once bustling Bell farmhouse became a place of deep sorrow and quiet reflection. The family tried to rebuild their lives, but the emotional scars left by the witch's torment were too deep to heal easily. Betsy, in particular, had suffered immensely. The physical attacks she had endured were gone, but the emotional trauma lingered. She had been haunted, manipulated, and terrorized by an unseen force that seemed to take joy in her pain. Now, though the witch's voice had gone silent, Betsy was left to grapple with the overwhelming fear and sadness that had become a part of her life. Despite the relative calm that followed John's death, the Bell family couldn't shake the feeling that the witch's presence still lingered, watching and waiting. They continued to hear faint, disembodied whispers from time to time, though the voice was not as aggressive as it once was. It was as if the entity was reminding them that it hadn't truly left, that it still had power over them. For the Bell family, life would never return to the way it had been before the haunting began. The peace they had once known was gone, replaced by the weight of the tragedy they had endured. As time passed, Betsy tried to move forward with her life. She had been engaged to a young man named Joshua Gardner before the haunting escalated, but the strain of the witch's attacks had put their relationship on hold. The entity had made it clear that it disapproved of their union, taunting Betsy about her engagement, and even going so far as to threaten Joshua's life. Betsy had been forced to break off the engagement, fearing that the witch's wrath would bring more suffering to those she loved. Even after John Bell's death, Betsy remained hesitant to reconnect with Joshua. She had no way of knowing whether the witch would return if she reignited the relationship. The fear of bringing the entity back into her life was too great, and so she made the difficult decision to move on. Betsy eventually married another man, Richard Powell, a local school teacher who had been a long-time family friend. Though Powell was much older than Betsy, their marriage brought her some measure of stability, and together they left Adams, Tennessee, to start a new life away from the farm that had become a place of nightmares. For the rest of the Bell family, life continued quietly on the farm. Though the Bell Witch's direct attacks had ceased, the farm remained a source of fascination and fear for the local community. Neighbors and visitors would often talk about the haunting in hushed tones, wondering if the witch might one day return. The legend of the Bell Witch grew, spreading far beyond the small Tennessee town. People from neighboring states came to visit the farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal activity that had once terrorized the Bell family. As the years went by, the story of the Bell Witch took on a life of its own. The tale of the vengeful entity that had tormented the Bell family and claimed the life of John Bell became a piece of local folklore, passed down from generation to generation. It was whispered around campfires, told in taverns, and shared among friends. Each retelling seemed to grow more fantastical, adding new details and layers to the story. Some claimed the witch was the spirit of a wronged woman. Others believed it was a demon sent to punish John Bell for some unknown sin. The true origin of the Bell Witch remained a mystery, one that no amount of speculation could solve. Despite the enduring fear surrounding the legend, the Bell family's descendants were able to live relatively peaceful lives after the events. Betsy and her husband lived out the rest of their days away from Adams, and though they could never fully escape the memory of the haunting, they managed to build a life free from the witch's influence. The Bell farm remained in the family for generations, though none who lived there ever experienced the same level of terror that John and Betsy had. However, the Bell Witch wasn't entirely gone. Several years after John Bell's death, the entity reportedly returned to the farm for a brief period. It made its presence known by speaking to members of the Bell family, though its tone was far less menacing than it had been during its original reign of terror. It seemed almost playful this time, offering cryptic messages and making predictions about the future. The witch claimed it would return again one day, though it gave no clear indication of when or why. After a short time, the voice disappeared once more, leaving the family in a state of unease. True to its word, the Bell Witch never fully faded from memory. Even though the farm grew quiet again and no further violent hauntings occurred, the legacy of the witch remained firmly entrenched in the town's history. Locals continued to speak of the Bell Witch in reverent tones, warning their children not to venture too close to the old Bell property after dark, for fear that the spirit might still be lingering, waiting for another chance to wreak havoc. The legend of the Bell Witch has endured for nearly 2 centuries, captivating the imagination of those who hear it. Skeptics have tried to explain away the events as superstition or mass hysteria, while believers hold fast to the notion that something truly supernatural took place on the Bell farm. The story has inspired countless books, articles, and even films, solidifying its place as one of America's most famous hauntings. To this day, visitors still come to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Bell Witch or to feel the lingering energy of the entity that once terrorized a family and captivated a nation. Whether they are true believers or merely curious thrill seekers, they all leave with a sense of unease, as if the witch's spirit still lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. For the Bell family, the memory of those years will never fade. The death of John Bell, the torment of Betsy, and the voice that haunted their every waking moment left a mark that time could never fully erase. Though the witch's physical presence may have waned, its legacy lives on, a chilling reminder of the power of the unknown and the horrors that sometimes lie just beyond the veil of the ordinary. In the late 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of war, the quiet English countryside in Suffolk held secrets long buried beneath the earth. The land, rolling and green, had a gentle way of keeping its past concealed. But for Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo Estate, the ancient burial mounds on her property stirred her curiosity. Edith was a wealthy widow in her 50s, and despite her age, she possessed an adventurous spirit. She had always been fascinated by history and archaeology. After years of living on the estate and gazing at the mounds, she began to wonder what lay beneath them. Her interest grew after hearing local legends that these mounds might hide long-lost treasures, perhaps even the resting place of kings. It was the summer of 1938 when Edith finally decided to act. She had been reading articles on recent archaeological digs and, inspired, she contacted the local Ipswich Museum for advice. They recommended Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist with a passion for unearthing history. Though not formally trained, Brown had a deep knowledge of the land and a reputation for careful, thorough work. Edith invited him to the estate, and soon an agreement was made to begin exploring the mysterious mounds. Basil Brown was not a man of wealth or high education, but he possessed a talent that few others did, a sense of the land. He had an ability to read the earth and understand its secrets. When he first set foot on Sutton Hoo, he was struck by the sheer size of the mounds. Some were as tall as trees, looming over the landscape like sentinels guarding something precious. The excavation began in earnest, but no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The first few days were slow. Basil and his small team of laborers worked carefully, mindful not to damage anything. They had no idea what lay beneath, whether it would be an empty mound or something extraordinary. At first, the dig revealed little more than small fragments of iron and decayed wood, signs that the mound had been disturbed before. Yet Basil remained optimistic. He knew that patience was key. As the team continued to remove layers of earth, something remarkable began to take shape, the outline of a ship. Brown could hardly believe his eyes. The sandy soil had preserved an impression of a ship, large enough to befit royalty. The wood had long since decayed, leaving only a ghostly imprint, but the form of the ship was unmistakable. It stretched nearly 90 feet long, a size that suggested this was no ordinary burial. This was something far grander. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Edith Pretty herself came to the site daily, watching with excitement as the ancient vessel emerged from the soil. She had hoped for something significant, but the magnitude of what was being uncovered exceeded her wildest dreams. The ship's structure, though fragile and partially destroyed by time, was evidence of a culture that had mastery over the sea. But it wasn't just the size of the ship that astonished the team. As they dug deeper, they realized that the vessel had been used as a burial ship, likely for someone of great importance. The thought lingered. Could this be the resting place of a long-forgotten king? Excitement turned to trepidation as the team carefully uncovered more of the ship. The scale of the task ahead became clearer. This was not a simple dig. It was a mission to recover a piece of history so old that its very existence had been forgotten. Every move had to be precise, every piece of earth removed with care. Basil Brown knew the significance of what they had found, but he also understood the risks. An excavation of this scale had never been attempted before in England, at least not with such a delicate site. The ship was a marvel, but it was fragile. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. As more of the ship was revealed, it became clear that this was not an isolated find. The ship was part of a much larger burial complex, perhaps one used by an elite group of people warriors, leaders, and rulers. The ship had been placed in the earth with great care, loaded with treasures meant to accompany its occupant into the afterlife. By the end of the summer, the excavation had gained attention beyond Suffolk. Archaeologists from across Britain began to take notice. The press, too, caught wind of the discovery. Headlines soon spoke of Britain's greatest find, and speculation ran wild about the identity of the person buried within the ship. Some believed it could be a legendary king or warrior, a figure whose story had been lost to time. Despite the growing attention, Edith Pretty remained modest about her role in the discovery. She had simply acted on a hunch, following her curiosity. But as the ship continued to reveal its secrets, it became clear that her decision to explore the mounds was one that would reshape the understanding of England's ancient history. The discovery of the ship set the stage for a much larger adventure, one that would continue to unfold in the months and years to come. For now, though, the ship lay beneath the soil, waiting for its full story to be told. As the sun rose over the fields of Suffolk in the summer of 1939, a small team of workers arrived at Suttonhoo, eager to continue their excavation of what was shaping up to be one of the most remarkable finds in British history. Basil Brown, the archaeologist leading the dig, had uncovered the outline of an ancient ship. But what lay beneath was still a mystery. The real work was only just beginning. The excavation site, now buzzing with activity, was far from a glamorous operation. With no heavy machinery and only simple tools like shovels, trowels, and brushes, the work was slow, meticulous, and physically demanding. Each layer of soil had to be removed carefully to avoid disturbing any fragile artifacts that might lie beneath the surface. Time was not on their side, as the threat of war loomed over Europe, adding urgency to their efforts. A small team of workers, mostly local laborers, had little formal training in archaeology, but they followed his instructions diligently. He had a deep respect for the past, and he knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could erase vital clues to understanding the burial. The ship they had uncovered was not made of iron or stone. It had once been a grand wooden vessel. Over the centuries, the wood had decayed, leaving only the impression of the ship in the soil. This meant that the entire outline of the ship was incredibly delicate, requiring precision to uncover it without causing damage. As they dug deeper, the true size of the ship became more apparent. Nearly 90 feet long, it was the kind of ship that could only have belonged to someone of great importance. It wasn't just its size that amazed the team. It was the craftsmanship. The lines of the ship's hull were graceful, curving elegantly through the earth, a testament to the shipbuilders who had constructed it more than 1,000 years earlier. Brown's excitement grew as the excavation progressed, but so did his sense of responsibility. The discovery of the ship was already monumental, but he knew there had to be more. Anglo-Saxon burial customs suggested that whoever was buried here had been laid to rest with treasures fit for a king. The ship, it seemed, was just the beginning. As the days passed, the team began to uncover a wealth of small finds, pieces of iron, fragments of pottery, and even a few rusted nails that hinted at the ship's construction. These items were important, but they were not the treasures the team had hoped to find. Still, Basil remained patient. He knew that the most valuable artifacts were likely still hidden deeper within the burial chamber, and he was determined to reach them. The dig became more challenging as they approached the center of the ship, where the burial chamber was believed to be. The earth here was heavier, and the signs of earlier disturbances, likely grave robbers from centuries past, became more evident. Some parts of the ship had been damaged, either by the passage of time or by human hands, but there were still large sections of the vessel that remained untouched. One day, as the team carefully removed soil from the center of the ship, they uncovered something extraordinary, a large wooden structure that had once formed the burial chamber. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, the impression it left behind was unmistakable. The chamber was large enough to hold not only a body, but also the treasures that would have accompanied it. Basil Brown was struck by the enormity of what they had found. This wasn't just a ship burial, it was a royal tomb. The chamber was situated in the very heart of the ship, a place of honor reserved for someone of the highest status. Though the chamber had been damaged over the centuries, there were still signs that it had once held magnificent items. The team worked slowly, methodically, removing the earth surrounding the chamber. As they did, they began to find objects that hinted at the grandeur of the burial. The first signs were small metal fragments, delicate pieces of jewelry, and the remnants of finely crafted items that had once adorned the body. These objects, though decayed, were exquisite in their design, suggesting that the person buried here had been incredibly wealthy, perhaps even a king. But the true treasures of the burial had not yet been uncovered. Brown knew that the most significant finds were still hidden beneath layers of soil. The team worked tirelessly, day after day, uncovering more and more of the burial chamber. The anticipation was palpable. Every piece of earth they removed brought them closer to the moment of revelation. As the excavation continued, word of the discovery spread even further. Archaeologists from across the country began to take notice, and some even traveled to Sutton Hoo to witness the dig for themselves. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary excavation. What they had uncovered was one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the discovery. Despite the growing attention, Basil Brown remained focused on the task at hand. The pressure was immense, but he knew that they were on the verge of something incredible. The burial chamber was nearly fully exposed, and soon they would uncover the treasures that had been hidden for centuries. As the final layers of earth were removed from the chamber, the team began to realize just how grand the burial truly was. They found evidence of finely wrought metalwork, including gold and silver items that had once adorned the person buried within. Though many of the treasures had been damaged or lost to time, what remained was enough to suggest that this was the burial of someone truly significant. The discovery of the burial chamber was a turning point in the excavation. What had begun as a simple curiosity had become a full-scale archaeological dig, one that would change the understanding of early medieval England. For Basil Brown and his team, the discovery of the ship and the chamber was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the months and years to come. The discovery of the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo marked a turning point in the excavation. The ship had been a stunning find, but the treasures hidden within the chamber were what truly revealed the significance of this ancient burial. As Basil Brown and his team carefully removed the last layers of soil, they began to uncover a collection of artifacts that hinted at the immense wealth and status of the person entombed within. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the ship, had likely once contained a wooden coffin, though all traces of the wood had long since decayed. What remained, however, was a dazzling array of items that had been placed alongside the body items that spoke of a life of power, influence, and high social standing. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone of immense importance, perhaps even a king. One of the first objects to emerge from the soil was a magnificent helmet. Though damaged by time and the elements, it was clear that this was no simple piece of armor. The helmet was adorned with intricate designs, including representations of fierce animals and warriors, all crafted in exquisite detail. It had once been worn by a figure of great significance, someone who likely commanded both respect and fear. The helmet, with its mask-like faceplate and iron cheek pieces, gave the impression of a powerful warrior king. Its craftsmanship suggested that the person buried here had connections to distant lands, perhaps Scandinavia, where similar helmets had been found. As the team continued to excavate, they uncovered more treasures. A finely wrought sword was found next, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets. The sword was a symbol of power, not just a weapon, but a representation of the authority of the one who had wielded it. Alongside the sword were other items associated with warfare, including a large shield and a collection of spears. These were the tools of a leader, someone who had commanded armies and fought in battles. The items painted a picture of a man who had been both a ruler and a warrior, a figure whose life had been shaped by conflict and conquest. Yet the burial chamber also contained objects of great beauty, items that suggested the person buried here had enjoyed a life of luxury and refinement. Gold buckles, intricately crafted jewelry, and a collection of silverware were found, each piece more ornate than the last. Some of the items had been imported from far-off lands, including silver bowls and spoons from the Byzantine Empire, evidence of trade and cultural connections that spanned continents. These items showed that the person buried here had lived in a time when England was not an isolated island, but part of a wider world, a world connected by trade routes and diplomacy. Perhaps the most striking find was a large, elaborately decorated belt buckle made of solid gold. Weighing over a pound, the buckle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring interwoven patterns that symbolized strength and unity. Its size and weight suggested that it had been worn by someone of great stature, both physically and socially. The buckle, along with the other treasures, spoke of immense wealth. The kind of wealth that only the most powerful in society could accumulate. As the team cataloged the items found in the burial chamber, it became increasingly clear that this was not just a burial, it was a statement. The person buried here had wanted to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy. The ship, The treasures and the sheer scale of the burial all suggested that this had been a leader of extraordinary influence, someone who had shaped the course of history in their time. But who was this person? That question lingered over the excavation like a shadow. No body had been found in the burial chamber. Centuries of decay had left little more than traces of organic matter where the body once lay. Still, archaeologists were able to piece together clues from the artifacts and the burial itself. The size of the ship and the opulence of the treasures suggested that this was the grave of an Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps even Redwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. Redwald was a powerful figure in Anglo-Saxon England. According to historical records, he had been a strong leader who wielded significant influence over other kings in the region. He had converted to Christianity, but also maintained traditional pagan beliefs, a fact reflected in the mix of Christian and pagan symbols found in the burial chamber. If this was indeed the grave of Redwald, it would confirm his status as one of the most important figures of the Anglo-Saxon period. The burial also revealed much about the society in which this leader had lived. The treasures found in the chamber were not just symbols of personal wealth. They were representations of the interconnectedness of early medieval Europe. The silver from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian designs all pointed to a world in which goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across borders. But while the items found in the burial chamber were awe-inspiring, they also raised questions. What had caused this king to be buried in such a grand manner? Had his death been the result of natural causes, or had he fallen in battle? Had this burial been a display of his people's devotion, or was it meant to send a message to those who came after him? The ship, laden with treasures, seemed to speak of a desire to carry these symbols of power into the afterlife, a belief that even in death, this leader would continue to hold sway over the world. As the excavation came to an end, the team knew they had uncovered something truly extraordinary. The burial chamber at Sutton Hoo had revealed treasures that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years. Treasures that told the story of a long-forgotten king and the world in which he had lived. For Basil Brown and his team, it was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. But for the wider world, it was just the beginning of a new understanding of England's past. The treasures of Sutton Hoo would soon be displayed in museums, where people from all over the world could come and marvel at the craftsmanship and beauty of these ancient artifacts. Yet, even as they were cleaned and preserved, they would remain tied to the mystery of the person who had been buried in that ship, a figure whose identity might never be known for certain, but whose legacy would live on through the objects he left behind. The burial chamber had been unearthed, but its secrets would continue to captivate the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, and the public for generations to come. The excavation at Sutton Hoo had revealed extraordinary treasures, but it was the discovery's ripple effect that truly began to reshape the understanding of England's ancient past. As word of the find spread across Britain, the magnitude of what had been uncovered became clear, not just to archaeologists, but to the general public, scholars, and even political figures. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was quickly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, a window into a time that had long been shrouded in mystery. In the summer of 1939, just as the treasures from Sutton Hoo were being carefully excavated, the world was on the brink of conflict. The tensions leading to the outbreak of World War II were mounting, and in many ways, the discovery at Sutton Hoo served as a reminder of Britain's deep history and resilience. As the nation prepared for the uncertainties of war, the treasures from this ancient burial offered a sense of pride and continuity, connecting modern Britons to their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. For Edith Pretty, the landowner whose curiosity had sparked the excavation, the discovery had an emotional impact. She had long suspected that the mounds on her estate hid something special, but even she couldn't have imagined the grandeur of what lay beneath. Edith, a reserved and thoughtful woman, had always been interested in history and archaeology, but the scale of the find at Sutton Hoo exceeded her wildest expectations. She visited the excavation site daily, quietly observing as Basil Brown and his team painstakingly unearthed each artifact. Though Edith had initiated the dig, she remained humble about her role, insisting that the discovery belonged to history. In the months following the excavation, Edith made a decision that would forever cement her place in the story of Sutton Hoo. Rather than keeping the treasures for herself or selling them, she donated the entire collection to the British Museum. It was an act of generosity that reflected her deep sense of responsibility to history and her desire for the treasures to be studied and preserved for future generations. The decision ensured that the artifacts would be accessible to the public and to scholars, who would spend decades analyzing the find and its implications. The British Museum, which had long been a repository for the world's greatest cultural artifacts, was quick to recognize the importance of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The items, including the famous helmet, the gold belt buckle, and the intricately crafted jewelry, were displayed prominently, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond. People flocked to see the artifacts, eager to catch a glimpse of the ancient past and to learn more about the mysterious figure who had been buried in such splendor. The public reaction to the Sutton Hoo discovery was overwhelming. Newspapers ran headlines about the buried treasure and the king in the ship, fueling speculation about the identity of the person entombed in the ship burial. Theories abounded, with some suggesting that the ship had belonged to a legendary warrior, while others believed it was the resting place of a great king. The fascination with the find extended beyond the borders of Britain, with international scholars and archaeologists expressing interest in studying the artifacts and the burial site. But while the treasures themselves were stunning, it was the broader implications of the discovery that truly excited the academic community. Before Sutton Hoo, the early medieval period in England, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was seen as a time of cultural stagnation, a period following the fall of the Roman Empire, when much of Europe was thought to have fallen into disarray. The Sutton Hoo find challenged this view, offering evidence of a sophisticated and cosmopolitan society that had existed in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. The discovery of objects from distant lands, including silverware from Byzantium and garnets from as far away as India, demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon elite were part of a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. These connections extended across Europe and beyond, suggesting that early medieval England was far more interconnected with the wider world than previously thought. The items found in the burial chamber revealed a society that valued craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth, a far cry from the image of a dark and isolated age. For historians and archaeologists, the Sutton Hoo ship burial opened up new lines of inquiry. Who was the person buried in the ship, and what did his burial tell us about the society he lived in? The consensus began to form around the idea that the burial belonged to Redwold, the king of East Anglia, a powerful figure who had been instrumental in the politics of early medieval England. While no definitive proof existed to confirm Redwold's identity as the person buried in the ship, the evidence, both historical and archaeological, pointed strongly in that direction. As the academic community delved deeper into the meaning of the Sutton Hoo treasures, the site itself became a point of national pride. The discovery was seen as a testament to Britain's deep and rich history, a reminder that the country's roots extended far back into the early medieval period. This sense of pride was particularly potent in the context of the looming war. As Britain prepared for the possibility of conflict, the Sutton Hoo find served as a symbol of resilience and continuity, a reminder that the nation had weathered countless challenges throughout its long history. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought new challenges to the preservation of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, were packed away and moved to secure storage to protect them from potential bombing raids. It would be several years before they could be displayed again, but even in storage, the significance of the find continued to grow. In the years following the war, the treasures of Sutton Hoo were once again placed on display, drawing renewed interest from scholars and the public alike. The site itself became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in England's early medieval past. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo continued, with new discoveries shedding further light on the burial and the culture that had created it. As time passed, the Sutton Hoo ship burial became more than just an archaeological discovery. It became a symbol of Britain's cultural heritage. The treasures found in the burial chamber were celebrated not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a connection to the distant past, to a time when kings ruled the land and the seas, and when the Anglo-Saxon people laid the foundations for the England that would emerge in the centuries to come. The impact of Sutton Hoo extended beyond the academic world. It influenced popular culture, inspiring books, films, and even artwork. The treasures, with their intricate designs and mysterious origins, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Sutton Hoo helmet, in particular, became an iconic symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, its distinctive design appearing in countless representations of early medieval warriors. But more than anything, Sutton Hoo stood as a testament to the power of curiosity and perseverance. What had begun as a simple desire to explore a set of burial mounds on a quiet Suffolk estate had led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. The impact of that discovery would be felt for generations, reminding the world of the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxon people and the mysteries that still lay buried beneath the earth. The Sutton Hoo discovery forever altered the understanding of early medieval England. Long after the final artifact had been unearthed and the excavation had concluded, the mysteries of the ship burial continued to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the general public. The artifacts, now safely housed in the British Museum, were more than just relics. They were keys to unlocking a forgotten past, one that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As scholars continued to study the treasures, new insights into the life and times of the Anglo-Saxons emerged. The burial itself became a symbol of the sophisticated society that had existed in England during the early 7th century, a society far more complex and interconnected than previously believed. Sutton Hoo had given the world a glimpse into the life of a ruler who had commanded immense respect and wielded significant power, whether it was Redwold, as many believed, or another figure of equal prominence. Despite all that had been uncovered, questions still lingered. Chief among them was the identity of the person buried in the ship. While the evidence pointed strongly to Redwold, the lack of definitive proof left room for debate. Some scholars suggested alternative possibilities, including other kings or powerful nobles from the East Anglian kingdom. The absence of human remains, likely lost to the ravages of time and the acidic soil, meant that the mystery of the burial's occupant might never be fully resolved. Even without a clear identity, the significance of the burial was undeniable. The ship, the treasures, and the careful arrangement of the grave goods all pointed to someone of immense importance. This was a person whose life had been marked by power, prestige, and wealth, someone who had commanded loyalty and respect from those around them. The grandeur of the burial reflected the importance placed on status and honor in Anglo-Saxon society, where kings and nobles were celebrated both in life and in death. The mystery extended beyond the identity of the buried figure. The purpose of the ship burial itself raised questions. Why had such an elaborate ceremony been conducted, and what did it symbolize? Ship burials were rare in England, and the practice was more commonly associated with Scandinavian cultures. Some historians believed that the Sutton Hoo burial was a reflection of the complex cultural influences at play in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had come to Britain as invaders, had absorbed elements of both Roman and Scandinavian traditions. creating a unique blend of customs and beliefs. The ship burial, with its mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, suggested that the person buried at Sutton Hoo had navigated a world in which old and new beliefs coexisted. Redwald, if he was indeed the person buried there, had been known for his dual faith embracing Christianity while still honoring traditional pagan practices. The burial reflected this tension, with the treasures revealing a world in which religious beliefs were evolving, but not yet settled. The items found in the burial chamber also offered clues about the broader world in which this person had lived. The silverware from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian and Frankish designs all pointed to a world connected by trade and diplomacy. The Sutton Hoo burial was not just a testament to one person's power. It was a reflection of a global network of exchange where goods and ideas flowed across borders. As the years passed, Sutton Hoo became a touchstone for those studying the early medieval period. Archaeologists continued to explore the site, conducting further excavations and uncovering additional evidence of the Anglo-Saxon people who had once inhabited the area. While no discoveries rivaled the grandeur of the original ship burial, each new find added to the growing picture of life in East Anglia during the early 7th century. The site itself was transformed into a place of historical importance. Sutton Hoo, once a quiet estate with little public attention, became a destination for visitors from around the world. People came to walk among the burial mounds, to imagine the grand ship that had once rested beneath the earth, and to learn about the Anglo-Saxon kings who had shaped England's early history. The National Trust, which took over the management of the site, worked to preserve the landscape and educate the public about the significance of the discovery. The Sutton Hoo ship burial also left a lasting mark on popular culture. The story of the excavation and the treasures it uncovered inspired books, documentaries, and films, all seeking to capture the drama and mystery of the find. The iconic image of the Sutton Hoo helmet, with its menacing faceplate and intricate designs, became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, appearing in countless depictions of early medieval warriors. The discovery continued to spark the imaginations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who were drawn to the idea of a long-lost king buried with his treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet for all the attention Sutton Hoo received, the site remained, at its core, a place of deep historical and emotional significance. The ship burial was a reminder of the fragility of history, of how easily the past can be forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth, and how it can be uncovered only through persistence and curiosity. Basil Brown, the self-taught archaeologist who had first unearthed the ship, had never imagined the scope of what he would find. His dedication and careful work had revealed a treasure trove of history that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the decades following the excavation, Brown's role in the discovery was finally recognized. Though initially overshadowed by professional archaeologists who had later joined the dig, Brown's contributions were celebrated as those of a skilled and dedicated archaeologist. His careful methods and deep respect for the site had ensured that the treasures of Sutton Hoo were preserved for future generations. Today, he is remembered as the man who brought one of England's greatest archaeological discoveries to light. As the 21st century began, Sutton Hoo continued to capture the public's imagination. New technologies allowed archaeologists to explore the site in ways that had once been impossible, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search for hidden features beneath the earth. These advancements, while yielding fascinating insights, also underscored how much of the past still lay waiting to be discovered. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that archaeologists and historians were still piecing together. For all the answers Sutton Hoo had provided, the site remained a place of wonder and speculation. Who had been buried there, and what had their life been like? What had driven their people to create such a magnificent burial? And what did it say about their beliefs, their values, and their place in the world. These questions, and many others, would likely remain unanswered, but that was part of the magic of Sutton Hoo. It was a place where history and mystery intertwined, where the past reached out to the present in ways both profound and elusive. The ship and its treasures had been buried for more than 1,000 years, hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to be found. And now, as the story of Sutton Hoo continued to unfold, it was clear that the discovery had not only changed the way people understood the past, it had become part of the fabric of Britain's national identity, a reminder of the deep roots that connected the present to the distant, mysterious past. Hill House stood alone, dark and foreboding against the backdrop of the hills. It loomed over the landscape like a forgotten giant, its jagged edges cutting sharply into the sky. For decades, rumors of its malevolence spread far and wide. People spoke in whispers about the strange happenings within its walls, events that no one could quite explain. Now, it was about to host a new group of visitors, each with their own reasons for being drawn to the house's mystery. Little did they know, they would leave with much more than they expected. Dr. John Montague, a scholar of the supernatural, was the one who had orchestrated this visit. A methodical man with a quiet obsession, he had spent years collecting accounts of haunted places, but Hill House was different. It had a reputation that made even the most hardened skeptic shudder. It wasn't just another haunted house. It was something worse, something alive in its own way. Dr. Montague believed that if he could document its phenomena, he would finally have the proof he needed to establish his theories on the supernatural. The doctor had invited 3 others to accompany him for the summer. Eleanor Vance was the first to accept the invitation. She was a woman who, for most of her life, had been invisible to the world. At 32, Eleanor had spent her youth caring for her ailing mother in a life of solitude. When her mother passed, Eleanor was left with nothing but her bitterness and regret. The invitation from Dr. Montague offered her something she had never had, an escape. Eleanor had no home to speak of, no career, and no one waiting for her anywhere. The idea of escaping the Hill House, even with its dark reputation, was better than returning to her sister's house, where she was nothing more than an unwanted burden. As she drove through the countryside, Eleanor felt a rush of exhilaration, a fleeting sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. But as the miles disappeared behind her and Hill House drew nearer, an uneasy feeling began to creep in. The second guest was Theodora, an artist with a sharp wit and a tendency to hide her true emotions behind laughter and sarcasm. She was everything Eleanor wasn't: confident, carefree, and vibrant. Dr. Montague had chosen her because of her supposed psychic sensitivity, although Theodora never took such things seriously. For her, this was just another adventure, a way to pass the time during the summer. Luke Sanderson, the final member of the group, was the heir to Hill House. Though he had never set foot inside it before, Luke wasn't thrilled about spending his time in a place everyone in his family avoided. But he was obliged to join the others, both because it was his inheritance and because his aunt insisted. To him, Hill House was simply an old structure, nothing more. He wasn't particularly interested in the supernatural, but he wasn't about to turn down the opportunity to meet new people and enjoy some good company. The 3 guests arrived separately, each with their own expectations, but all were struck by the sight of Hill House when they first laid eyes on it. Its towering walls seemed to lean toward them, as if they were being drawn into its grasp. The house was more than just unsettling. It was wrong in some unspoken way. The architecture was deliberately designed to disorient, with sharp angles and strange curves that made the house feel unnatural. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in, ready to trap anyone foolish enough to step inside. Eleanor was the first to arrive, her heart pounding as she approached the iron gates. She hesitated, gripping the wheel of her car tightly. Her first instinct was to turn back, to leave Hill House and never look back. But something kept her there. Perhaps it was her longing for a place where she could belong, or perhaps it was something darker, an unspoken pull from the house itself. With a deep breath, Eleanor pushed forward, driving through the gates and up the gravel road toward the house. As she parked and stepped out of the car, the stillness of the place enveloped her. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees. It was as if the house existed in a world separate from everything else. As she made her way to the entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and she was greeted by Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper, a doorwoman with a cold demeanor. Mrs. Dudley made it clear that she had no interest in the guests or their experiments. She had one job, to keep the house running, and she wasn't going to stick around after dark. "I leave before nightfall," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "No one stays after dark." Eleanor shivered, unsure if the warning was meant for her or if it was just Mrs. Dudley's way of doing things. Either way, the message was clear. Hill House had its own rules, and the living didn't belong there once the sun went down. Soon after, Theodora and Luke arrived, both of them trying to mask their unease with light conversation. Dr. Montague greeted them warmly, his excitement barely contained. This was the beginning of his great experiment, and he was certain that Hill House would deliver the proof he sought. Together, the group explored the house, marveling at its grand but unsettling design. Every room felt wrong. The proportions were slightly off, and the angles made them feel like they were being watched. As night fell, the group gathered in the parlor, ready for the first of many nights at Hill House. Outside, the sun disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows across the house. Inside, the air grew colder, and a heavy silence settled over them. Eleanor felt it first, a sense of dread creeping up her spine, as if the house was slowly closing in around her. She glanced at Theodora, who smiled, seemingly unaffected, but Eleanor could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. Luke, too, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dr. Montague's voice broke the silence. "Welcome to Hill House," he said softly, "and may whatever walks here walk alone." But Eleanor knew, deep down, that they were never truly alone. Not in Hill House. The house had been waiting. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was suddenly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound, echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over a teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked. After all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The first night at Hill House was quiet, unnervingly so. No disturbances, no cold drafts, no ghostly whispers. Just a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press in on all sides. For the group, this silence felt like a reprieve, though none of them voiced their relief aloud. Dr. Montague had warned them that the house would take time to reveal its secrets, and so they settled into the routine of exploring the mansion, observing its strange features, and waiting for something to happen. Eleanor, in particular, was on edge. She had expected immediate signs of the supernatural, perhaps a door slamming on its own, or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. But Hill House didn't offer any such obvious signs. Instead, it exerted a quieter, more insidious influence. There was something unsettling in the air, something unseen yet always present. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, biding its time. Theodora, ever the optimist, treated the situation lightly. She made jokes to ease the tension, poking fun at the house's ominous reputation. "I was expecting more theatrics," she said one morning over breakfast. "A little poltergeist action, at least." Eleanor smiled, grateful for the attempt at levity, but the nagging sense of dread in the pit of her stomach never fully went away. Theodora seemed so at ease, but Eleanor wondered if it was just a mask to hide her own unease. Luke, on the other hand, appeared disinterested. He spent his time lounging around, flipping through old books he found in the library, or lazily inspecting the rooms. For him, this was nothing more than a bizarre vacation, and his carefree attitude irritated Eleanor. How could he be so indifferent when Hill House felt so palpably dangerous? Dr. Montague remained the most focused. He wandered the halls with his notebook, jotting down every strange detail, even if it was nothing more than a creaky floorboard or a faint change in temperature. He believed that the house would eventually begin to manifest its true nature, and he was determined not to miss a single moment. The doctor's presence reassured Eleanor, but only slightly. His rational explanations provided a counterbalance to her growing anxiety. But as each day passed, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was subtly changing inside her. As the days turned into nights, the group began to notice the small, almost imperceptible oddities that defined Hill House. The doors never stayed open, no matter how wide they were left. They always swung shut with a soft click, as if the house refused to let the outside world in. The angles of the rooms felt wrong, the corners too sharp or too curved, creating a sense of disorientation. At times, the halls seemed to stretch longer than they had before, as though the house were shifting itself around them. Eleanor found herself strangely drawn to the house, as if it were calling to her in some silent way. She would wander the halls alone, feeling a connection to the mansion she couldn't explain. The house's dark wood paneling and intricate carvings seemed to pulse with a life of their own. There were moments when Eleanor felt almost comforted by the oppressive stillness, as though Hill House understood her in a way no one else ever had. But along with that comfort came a growing sense of unease. Each night, Eleanor would wake in her bed, heart racing, convinced that someone or something was standing just outside her door. She would lie there, frozen, listening to the silence, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But the feeling of being watched never left her. The others began to feel it too. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Theodora broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Does anyone else feel like the house is staring at us?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Luke raised an eyebrow, glancing around. "I wouldn't say staring," he replied, "but there's definitely something strange about this place." Dr. Montague nodded thoughtfully, as if he had expected this. "Hill House is known for its ability to influence," he said carefully. "It's not always about what you can see or hear. The house affects you in subtle ways. You might feel watched or uneasy, but it's all part of the experience. We must remain objective." Objective. Eleanor clung to that word, but it felt hollow. How could she remain objective when the walls themselves seemed to be closing in on her? She had never been one to believe in the supernatural, yet Hill House was doing something to her, something that made her question everything she thought she knew. The next night, the disturbances began in earnest. It started with a loud banging sound, echoing through the house. The group was gathered in the parlor when the noise rang out, startling them all. Theodora jumped, knocking over her teacup, while Luke muttered a curse under his breath. Dr. Montague stood, listening carefully. "Did you hear where it came from?" he asked, his voice tense. Eleanor shook her head, her heart pounding. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating off the walls. Another bang followed, then another, growing louder and more insistent. The sound was unlike anything Eleanor had ever heard, deep, guttural, and impossibly loud, as if the house itself was groaning in pain. "Stay together," Dr. Montague instructed, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. They huddled together, listening as the noise continued to echo through the halls. After what felt like an eternity, the banging stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. She could feel her pulse racing, her skin cold with fear. She wanted to believe it was just a structural issue old houses creaked. After all, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Hill House was waking up, and it was starting to reach out. That night, the group decided to retire early, but sleep was elusive. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to sleep, but the unease lingered. It was then that she heard a soft voice, barely audible, calling her name. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Eleanor," it whispered, gentle yet insistent. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up in bed, heart pounding. The voice was coming from outside her door, just beyond the threshold. She swallowed, gripping the edges of the blanket tightly. Was someone playing a cruel trick on her, or was this the house? The possibility of either terrified her. She stayed frozen in bed, unable to move, until the voice faded into the silence once more. The fear lingered, even after the sound was gone, and Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the house had spoken to her personally, intimately, in a way that no one else had experienced. Hill House was no longer just a house. It was something more, something alive, and Eleanor feared it had chosen her. The days in Hill House began to blur, each one bleeding into the next. The once playful atmosphere among the group had grown tense, weighed down by the increasing strangeness that seemed to infest every corner of the mansion. The subtle disturbances that had started with noises and inexplicable cold spots were now escalating into something far more sinister. Eleanor felt it most acutely. Each night, her dreams became more vivid, more disorienting. Shadows danced across her room, and she swore she could hear whispers, the same voice that had called her name that first night. The voice no longer startled her, though. Ugh. Instead, she found herself listening for it, waiting for it to speak again. And when it did, it was almost comforting, as though the house understood her deepest thoughts and longings. But that comfort came with a price. Hill House was changing Eleanor. Where once she had been shy, withdrawn, and uncertain, now she felt a strange, dark confidence creeping in. It wasn't the kind of confidence that made her feel stronger. It was more like a weight pressing down on her, pushing her to let go of her old self. Every time she wandered the house alone, she felt it pulling her further into its grasp, as if it were slowly becoming a part of her. The others noticed the change in her, but no one spoke of it directly. Theodora, ever sensitive to the emotions of those around her, had grown distant from Eleanor. Where they once shared a bond, an unspoken tension now lingered between them. Theodora still laughed and joked, but her gaze had become sharp, suspicious. She was watching Eleanor carefully, as if she were afraid of what her friend might do, or perhaps of what the house might do to her. One evening, as they gathered in the parlor, Theodora finally confronted Eleanor, though her words were veiled in humor. "You're looking a little pale, Eleanor," she said with a playful smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Hill House isn't agreeing with you, is it?" Eleanor bristled at the comment, her nerves already frayed from the sleepless nights and the constant feeling of being watched. "I'm fine," she snapped, more harshly than she intended. She immediately regretted it, but the words were out, and she saw the flicker of surprise and perhaps fear in Theodora's expression. Dr. Montague, ever the mediator, stepped in to ease the tension. "We're all under a lot of stress," he said calmly. "Hill House has a way of playing tricks on the mind. It's important that we stick together and not let the house influence us." But even as he spoke, the house seemed to respond. A loud, hollow knock echoed through the walls, as if something was rapping on the wood from within. The noise reverberated through the room, freezing them in place. Eleanor's heart pounded as she listened. It wasn't just a random sound. It was deliberate, rhythmic, almost as if someone or something was trying to get in. Luke, who had been lounging carelessly in his chair, jumped to his feet, his face pale. What the hell was that? He muttered, his usual nonchalance gone. Dr. Montague motioned for calm, but the tension was thick in the air. "Everyone stay together," he ordered. "We've prepared for this. It's just the house. It's reacting to us." Reacting. Eleanor felt the word sink into her mind like a stone. The house wasn't just reacting, it was communicating. She could feel it. It was reaching out, trying to make contact, and she was the one it had chosen. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent. The group huddled closer together, their fear palpable. For a moment, Eleanor felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the house's grasp and never look back. But even as the thought crossed her mind, another voice, her own, but darker, quieter, whispered inside her, "This is where you belong. Don't leave, not yet." The noise abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The group sat frozen, their breaths shallow, waiting for the next attack, but nothing came. After what felt like hours, Dr. Montague finally spoke. "It's over for now," he said, though his voice was tense. "We need to stay vigilant. The house is testing us." They retired to their rooms early that night, though none of them expected to sleep. Eleanor lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the events of the evening replaying in her mind. The knocking, the tension, Theodora's strange look, all of it felt like a warning. But from whom? From the house? Or from herself? Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and filled with disturbing dreams. Eleanor found herself wandering through the dark corridors of Hill House, but the walls were different, now closer, more confining. They seemed to pulse with life, breathing in sync with her own panicked breaths. As she walked, the floor shifted beneath her feet, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. In her dream, the house whispered to her again, that same familiar voice. "You can't leave, Eleanor. You don't want to. This is where you're meant to be." She awoke in a cold sweat, her heart racing. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, the dream still clinging to her like a second skin. The room was dark, the shadows deep and unfamiliar, but the overwhelming sense of being watched was all too real. Eleanor glanced at the door. It was closed, just as she had left it, but something was wrong. She could feel it. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She stood, hesitating for a moment, then moved toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. When she opened it, the hallway stretched out before her, empty and silent. But the moment she stepped outside, she felt the temperature drop. The cold wrapped around her like a tight grip, and the air seemed to hum with a low, steady vibration. She wasn't alone. Something was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. The whisper came again, soft but insistent. "Come closer, Eleanor." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt frozen, as if the house had taken control of her limbs, holding her in place. The whisper grew louder, more demanding, as if it were coming from inside her own mind. Closer. Eleanor clenched her fists, fighting the urge to move, to obey. But the pull was too strong. She took one step forward, then another, her feet moving of their own accord. The shadows in the hallway seemed to shift, growing darker, thicker, until they almost swallowed her whole. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the feeling vanished. The cold dissipated, the air returned to normal, and Eleanor was left standing in the middle of the hallway, trembling. She didn't know how long she stood there, but when she finally gathered the strength to return to her room, she collapsed onto the bed, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, she told no one what had happened. Not Theodora, not Dr. Montague, not even Luke, who seemed as unaffected by the house as ever. But Eleanor knew that something inside her had changed. The house had touched her, reached into her mind, and planted a seed of doubt that was slowly growing. Hill House was no longer just a building. It was something more, a living entity, feeding off their fear, twisting their thoughts, and slowly unraveling their sense of reality. And Eleanor, whether she admitted it or not, was becoming part of it. By the time the fourth week in Hill House arrived, the atmosphere had shifted from eerie to oppressive. Every inch of the house seemed charged with a malevolent energy that none of them could fully explain. No longer content with subtle whispers and cold drafts, the house had grown more active, more aggressive. It was as if the mansion itself was waking up, and its attention was fixed on Eleanor. Theodora, once a source of comfort with her sharp wit and playful teasing, now kept her distance from Eleanor. The tension between them was palpable, and Eleanor couldn't ignore the feeling that Theodora was afraid of her, or rather, of what the house was doing to her. The unspoken barrier between them only made Eleanor feel more isolated, more trapped in her own mind. She began to question whether Theodora had ever truly been her friend, or if she had just been pretending all along. Luke, who had never taken the haunting seriously, was becoming more and more irritable. His usual carefree attitude had given way to frustration, and he spent much of his time pacing through the house, as though he was searching for an escape. But there was no escape, not from Hill House. The mansion's strange geometry seemed to twist and turn in on itself, making the corridors feel endless and the rooms disorienting. Even when they tried to leave, the house had a way of leading them back inside. Dr. Montague was still focused on his research, scribbling notes with frantic determination. But even he was beginning to show signs of strain. His once calm demeanor had cracked, revealing the deep anxiety beneath. The house was proving more powerful than he had anticipated, and though he tried to maintain a scientific detachment, it was clear that Hill House had shaken him. He had lost control of the experiment, and he knew it. Eleanor, meanwhile, was slipping further into the house's grip. Her dreams had become darker, more vivid, and the line between reality and imagination was blurring. She could no longer tell if the strange things she was experiencing were real, or if the house was playing tricks on her mind. The whispers had become more frequent, more persistent, and they no longer scared her. In fact, she had started to listen to them, to find comfort in their words. They understand me. The house understands me. It was a dangerous thought, but Eleanor couldn't help it. The more isolated she felt from the others, the more she turned to the house for comfort. It whispered to her, telling her that she belonged there, that she didn't need the others. And Eleanor began to believe it. One night, after another unsettling evening filled with unexplained noises and shifting shadows, Eleanor found herself wandering the halls of Hill House alone. She didn't know what had drawn her out of bed. Perhaps it was the pull of the house, or perhaps it was her own restless mind. Either way, she found herself moving through the mansion's darkened corridors, the wooden floorboards creaking softly beneath her feet. The house seemed to breathe around her, its very walls pulsating with a strange energy. Eleanor felt calm, almost serene, as if she were finally where she was meant to be. For the first time in her life, she felt seen. Truly seen. She came to a door at the end of the hallway, one she had never noticed before. It was slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. Without hesitation, she pushed it open and stepped into the room beyond. It was a small, dimly lit space with a single window that looked out over the dark, empty grounds of Hill House. The air in the room was cold, but Eleanor didn't feel the chill. Instead, she felt a strange warmth radiating from the center of the room. There, in the middle of the floor, was a mirror. Its surface was cracked, the fractured glass reflecting distorted images of the room and of Eleanor herself. She stepped closer, staring at her reflection. Her face looked pale, drawn, and tired, but there was something else in her eyes, something dark and unfamiliar. The mirror whispered to her, "You don't need them. They're holding you back. You've always been alone, Eleanor. But here, you can be free. You can be yourself." Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the mirror's cracked surface. The moment her fingers brushed the glass, she felt a surge of energy course through her. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like the house itself was pouring its power into her. For a brief, terrifying moment, Eleanor felt as though she were losing herself. The weight of her loneliness, her grief, her anger, it all pressed down on her, threatening to consume her. But the house whispered again, soothing her. "Let go, Eleanor. Let go of who you were. Be free." And she did. In that moment, standing before the cracked mirror, Eleanor let go. She let go of the years she had spent caring for her mother, of the bitterness and resentment that had built up inside her. She let go of the shame, the regret, the feeling of being invisible. And as she did, she felt something shift within her, something dark, something powerful. The house had given her a gift. It had taken her pain, her loneliness, and turned it into something else, something stronger. When Eleanor returned to the others the next morning, they noticed the change immediately. Her demeanor was different, calmer, more assured, but there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself. Theodora watched her with wary eyes, while Luke seemed to avoid her altogether. Even Dr. Montague appeared unnerved, though he said nothing. That day, the disturbances escalated. The walls groaned under an invisible pressure, and strange, unexplainable phenomena occurred throughout the house. Doors slammed shut with deafening force, and objects moved on their own. It was as if Hill House was coming alive, feeding off the group's fear and uncertainty. And through it all, Eleanor remained calm. She no longer felt afraid of the house. She felt connected to it. The house had chosen her, and she had accepted it. But Theodora wasn't fooled. That evening, as they sat together in the parlor, Theodora turned to Eleanor, her voice low and tense. "What's happening to you?" she asked. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not the same, Eleanor. You're different." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't the warm, shy smile she had once worn. It was something colder, more distant. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I've just realized something, that's all." Theodora shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "This house is doing something to you. It's trying to take you. Don't you see that?" Eleanor's smile faded. "Maybe I don't want to leave," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe this is where I belong." Theodora stared at her, horrified. "Eleanor, no. This isn't you. The house is manipulating you." But Eleanor had stopped listening. The house's whispers were louder now, drowning out Theodora's voice. "You don't need her. She's afraid of you. She'll never understand." And Eleanor believed it. She no longer needed the others. Hill House had given her something far more valuable, a sense of belonging, a place where she could finally be free. The cracks that had formed in her mind were spreading, and Eleanor could feel herself slipping further and further into the house's grasp. She didn't fight it. In the days that followed, the manifestations grew more violent. The house was unraveling, its dark energy seeping into every corner, every crevice. The others tried to reason with Eleanor, to pull her back, but it was too late. Hill House had claimed her, and she had let it. The house had become her refuge, her sanctuary, and she wasn't going to leave. Not ever. The final days in Hill House were a descent into chaos. The mansion, once eerie but manageable, now seemed intent on consuming those within it. Every room, every hallway felt alive with a malevolent energy that no one could ignore. The subtle games Hill House had played, the knocks, the whispers were gone. Now it was a full assault. The house wanted them out. Or worse, it wanted to trap them there forever. Eleanor had fully surrendered to its pull. Her connection to the house had deepened to the point where she could no longer tell where she ended and Hill House began. The whispers that had once haunted her in the dark now filled her mind even in the daylight. They were no longer warnings or invitations. They were commands, insistent and relentless. "Stay. You belong here. Let go of everything else. This is your home." Dr. Montague was the first to openly acknowledge the danger Eleanor was in. His once scientific curiosity had turned into concern. "We need to leave," he said to the group, his voice strained with the realization that he had lost control of the situation. "The house is becoming dangerous, especially for Eleanor. It's influencing her, perhaps more than we understand." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She was sitting by the window, gazing out into the bleak, foggy landscape that surrounded Hill House. Her expression was distant, almost peaceful, as though she was no longer part of the conversation. In her mind, the house was all that mattered. The outside world had become irrelevant. Theodora's patience had long since run out. "We can't just sit here and watch this happen," she snapped, her usual sharpness undercut by real fear. She glanced over at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and concern. She's not herself anymore. The house has taken her, and we have to do something. Luke, standing near the door, looked ready to leave at any moment. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fear that he couldn't shake. "We've stayed too long," he muttered. "We need to get out while we still can." But Eleanor wasn't leaving. She had made that clear. And more than that, the house wouldn't let her go. The others could sense it. Hill House had its grip on her, and it wasn't about to loosen. That night, the house showed its full power. The walls shook, the floors groaned, and doors slammed with a force that rattled the entire structure. It felt like the house was coming apart at the seams, but instead of fear, Eleanor felt exhilaration. The house was alive, and it was speaking to her. It wanted her. As the others scrambled in panic, trying to figure out whether to flee or huddle together in safety, Eleanor moved calmly through the chaos. The shadows seemed to reach for her, embracing her as she walked through the darkened halls. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, but they no longer frightened her. "You're home, Eleanor. This is where you've always belonged." The others tried to stop her. Theodora reached for her arm, pleading with her to come back to reality, but Eleanor pulled away with a strength that startled her friend. Dr. Montague tried to reason with her, his voice breaking with desperation, but his words didn't reach her. Luke, too scared to even approach her, watched from a distance, his face pale and drawn. Eleanor moved toward the grand staircase, her steps slow and deliberate. The house had led her there, guiding her to this final moment. The staircase loomed before her, a towering symbol of the house's power. She could feel the air around her vibrating with energy, as if the house itself was alive, watching her every move. As she stood at the top of the stairs, the voices filled her mind completely. "End it here, Eleanor. This is your final step. It's the only way to be free." For a brief moment, Eleanor hesitated. She looked down at the others below, their faces filled with horror and helplessness. But their fear felt distant to her now. The house had become her reality, and the people she once called friends were just shadows in her mind. Then, without another thought, Eleanor let herself go. But as she took the step forward, something in her shifted. A small, quiet voice her own fought its way through the cacophony of whispers. "Is this really what I want?" For a moment, Eleanor faltered. The house seemed to tighten its grip, but her mind, buried deep beneath the house's influence, was fighting back. She thought of the life she had left behind lonely, yes, but still hers. She remembered the kindness of strangers, the feeling of sunlight on her face, the warmth of a world beyond Hill House. Was it really too late to turn back? But the house was relentless. There is no turning back. This is where you belong. You can't escape now. The others watched in horror as Eleanor wavered at the top of the staircase. Dr. Montague shouted her name, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Theodora cried out, rushing toward the stairs, but Luke held her back, too afraid of what Eleanor might do. And then, with a final, shattering cry, Eleanor stepped forward. The house roared around her as she fell. Time seemed to slow as she tumbled down the stairs, her body twisting in the air. The others rushed to her, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they raced to catch her. But it was too late. Eleanor lay crumpled at the base of the staircase, her eyes closed, her body still. For a moment, there was only silence. The house, as if satisfied, seemed to calm. The groaning walls, the slamming doors, they all stopped. Hill House was still, as though it had finally taken what it wanted. Dr. Montague knelt beside Eleanor, his hand shaking as he checked for signs of life. Theodora stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Luke hovered nearby, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a hollow fear. But Eleanor was alive. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, she looked at the others as though seeing them for the first time in weeks. Her voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. I'm sorry," she whispered. The house remained quiet as they gathered her up, carrying her carefully to her room. The others didn't speak, their minds too overwhelmed by what had happened. Eleanor, too weak to stand, allowed herself to be led away. As she lay in bed that night, her body aching, her mind exhausted, Eleanor finally understood. Hill House had tried to take her, but something within her had resisted. She had come to the edge, looked into the abyss, and somehow she had pulled back. For now, but the house wasn't done with her. She could still feel its pull, still hear its whispers in the back of her mind. The fight wasn't over, and Eleanor knew it. Hill House was a living thing, and it didn't let go easily. As the house settled into its familiar, oppressive silence, Eleanor closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would leave. She had to. But part of her wondered if she would ever truly be free of Hill House, or if it had already taken more of her than she realized. The air in Paris had a certain chill that evening. It wasn't the typical autumn bite, but something deeper, a cold that seeped into the bones. Below the bustling city streets lay a labyrinth, a world few dared to enter, the Paris catacombs. What began as a solution to the overflowing cemetery centuries ago had become a place of mystery and, for some, fear. Beneath the cobblestones, millions of skeletal remains rested in neat stacks, but the deeper one ventured, the more unsettling the place became. Marcus had heard the stories, the whispered tales of explorers who never returned, the strange occurrences deep in the tunnels. He wasn't one to scare easily, though. He had seen his fair share of strange things while exploring abandoned buildings around Europe, and nothing had ever truly unnerved him. But there was something about the catacombs that felt different, something that gnawed at him, though he couldn't quite place it. Still, the pull was undeniable. Beside him, Clara and David checked their gear. Clara, the team's researcher, had spent months gathering information about the catacombs maps, legends, and accounts from others who had made the journey into the depths. David, the tech expert, fiddled with his camera, testing the night vision and audio equipment. They weren't amateurs. They had prepared meticulously. Yet there was an unspoken tension in the air between them, as if they all knew they were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The entrance was innocuous enough, a rusted metal door hidden in an alleyway, just a few blocks from a busy cafe. As they stepped inside, the noise of the city vanished, swallowed by the echoing silence of the tunnels. The walls seemed to close in almost immediately, their damp surfaces reflecting the faint glow of their headlamps. The narrow passage was just wide enough for them to walk single file, forcing them into a line that felt unnervingly vulnerable. As they descended, the air grew thicker, cooler. The city above faded further with every step, replaced by the oppressive weight of the earth pressing down on them. The first few chambers were filled with neatly stacked bones, arranged in patterns that were almost artistic. It was strange, standing among the dead like this, but it didn't feel threatening. Not yet. Clara moved ahead, her eyes scanning the walls, searching for markings she had read about. "This is where most tourists stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something. "They never go deeper than this." Marcus nodded, glancing at the map she had provided. It was old, drawn by someone who had ventured far beyond the usual paths. "We're not tourists," he muttered. They had a destination, a section of the catacombs rumored to be unexplored, untouched by modern visitors. Clara had uncovered references to it in obscure historical texts, vague mentions of chambers hidden beneath the known pathways. And it was this curiosity, this need to uncover the unknown, that had driven them to take on this dangerous journey. They pressed on, the tunnels becoming narrower, more uneven. The neat rows of bones disappeared, replaced by jagged rock and crumbling mortar. Here, the tunnels were less maintained. The passageways, feeling more like nature, had slowly begun to reclaim them. The further they walked, the quieter it became. Their footsteps seemed to echo too loudly, as though they were disturbing a silence that had existed for centuries. The deeper they went, the more unsettling it became. At first, it was subtle, the faint sound of dripping water, the occasional shift of loose stones beneath their feet. But soon, Clara began to slow her pace. "Did you hear that?" she asked, stopping abruptly. Marcus and David froze. "Hear what?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Clara turned, her expression difficult to read in the dim light. "I thought I heard footsteps." Marcus smirked. "Probably our own echoing. These tunnels can play tricks on you." But David shook his head. "No, it wasn't an echo," he said, his voice edged with concern. "It was behind us." They stood there for a moment, listening. The silence was deafening now, pressing in on them like the walls themselves were alive, waiting for something. Marcus brushed it off, urging them forward. "Let's keep moving. We've got a long way to go." They continued deeper, the tension growing thicker with every step. The air felt heavier, harder to breathe, as if the tunnels themselves were trying to warn them to turn back. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder, her unease infectious. Even Marcus found himself gripping the flashlight a little tighter, his confidence beginning to waver. They had prepared for physical dangers, getting lost, cave-ins, or dehydration, but none of them had considered that something else might be down here with them. Hours seemed to blur together. The tunnels twisted and branched in ways the map hadn't shown, and soon Marcus realized they were off course. They stopped in a larger chamber to recalibrate. The walls were damp, and the floor was uneven, covered with debris from a long-forgotten collapse. David fiddled with the camera again, his hand shaking slightly. "I'm not getting a signal anymore," he muttered. Clara knelt by the wall, tracing a faded symbol with her fingers. "This shouldn't be here," she whispered. "This wasn't in any of the records I found." Marcus crouched beside her, shining his light on the symbol. It looked ancient, worn down by time, but its shape was still discernible, something that resembled an eye, or perhaps a gate. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. He stood up, his pulse quickening. "Let's move. We need to get back on track." They pressed on, but the further they walked, the stranger things became. The tunnels seemed to shift, the air growing colder. At one point, Marcus stopped abruptly, staring into the darkness ahead. "Do you see that?" he whispered. Clara and David turned to where he was pointing, their lights sweeping across the tunnel. For a brief moment, something flickered, a shadow that didn't belong to any of them, moving swiftly out of sight. David cursed under his breath. "We're not alone down here." No one spoke after that. The silence became suffocating, punctuated only by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. They were far from where they had started now, deeper than any of them had intended to go. And in the distance, faint but undeniable, came the sound of footsteps. Not their own. The sound of footsteps echoed unnervingly through the tunnel, growing fainter and fainter, as if retreating into the very walls. The group stood frozen for a moment, not daring to speak, not even daring to breathe too loudly. It wasn't just the footsteps, it was the way they reverberated in the silence. Too distinct, too deliberate to be explained away by their own movements. There was something else down here. Marcus was the first to move, shining his flashlight toward the source of the sound. Nothing. Just an endless tunnel stretching into the dark, winding ahead like the throat of a sleeping beast. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but he couldn't let it show. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "If we stop now, we'll lose our bearings for good." David swallowed hard, but nodded, clutching his camera a little tighter. Clara hesitated, her eyes fixed on the shadows ahead, but she didn't argue. She knew as well as they all did that staying in one place down here was worse than moving forward, no matter what lay ahead. The group pressed on, but the sense of unease clung to them like a second skin. The further they went, the more the tunnels seemed to warp around them. The once familiar patterns of stacked bones and skeletal remains gave way to something more chaotic. Here, the walls seemed to twist unnaturally, the bones no longer arranged with care, but strewn haphazardly, as if thrown together by some unseen force. It was as though the catacombs themselves were rejecting their presence. As they walked, Clara found herself falling behind, her mind lost in the labyrinth of tunnels and flickering shadows. She kept hearing whispers, not the sound of voices, but something softer, more insidious, like the distant rustling of leaves or the fluttering of wings. She shook her head, trying to clear it. Focus. She had to focus. David, too, was struggling to maintain his composure. The camera felt heavier in his hands, and the tunnel seemed to press in on him, narrowing with every step. His breathing grew shallow, and he felt the unmistakable weight of being watched. It wasn't the darkness or the isolation that unnerved him. It was the sense that whatever was down here with them wasn't a lost soul or a forgotten spirit. It was something darker, something that had been waiting. They stopped at a crossroads where the tunnel branched in two different directions, both leading into yawning blackness. Clara unrolled the map and studied it in the beam of her headlamp. Her fingers trembled slightly as she traced their route. "We should be close to the chamber I found in the old records," she whispered, though her voice held little conviction. "If we keep to the left." Marcus nodded, glancing down the left tunnel. The air there seemed colder, thicker, as though it had been undisturbed for centuries. "Then that's where we'll go." But as they turned to make their way down the left tunnel, a sudden gust of wind swept through the corridor, an impossible thing. There was no breeze this deep underground. It was sharp, biting, and carried with it a smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. "Did you feel that?" David's voice was tight with alarm. Marcus nodded slowly. "Keep moving." The tunnel narrowed as they went deeper, forcing them to stoop slightly as the ceiling closed in on them. The walls were no longer lined with bones, but smooth stone, slick with moisture. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every step. Without warning, David stumbled, nearly dropping his camera. He cursed under his breath, reaching out to steady himself against the wall. His hand came away wet, slick with some dark, viscous substance that clung to his fingers. He wiped it off on his pants, his heart pounding in his chest. "Watch your step," Marcus muttered, though his own pulse was racing. His instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong, terribly wrong. But they had come too far to turn back now. Clara stopped suddenly, her light fixed on something ahead. "There," she said, her voice barely audible. At the far end of the tunnel was a doorway. Not just an opening in the rock, but a doorway made of carved stone, with intricate patterns etched into the surface. It didn't belong here. It was too deliberate, too out of place amidst the rough, natural caverns. This was what they had come for. They approached slowly, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The doorway loomed over them, imposing and ancient, as if it had been waiting for centuries to be discovered. Clara ran her hand over the carvings, her fingers tracing the strange symbols. She couldn't make sense of them. None of the research she had done had mentioned anything like this. It was as though they had stumbled upon something far older than the catacombs themselves. Marcus shone his light into the chamber beyond, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The room was vast, the ceiling lost in shadow, and the walls lined with what looked like more bones. But these were different, arranged in chaotic patterns, spiraling upward like some twisted art installation. The sight sent a shiver down his spine. Clara stepped through the doorway, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. David followed, his camera capturing everything, though his hands were shaking. Marcus hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could feel it now, the malevolent presence that lurked just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't a ghost or a spirit. It was something far worse. They had crossed a threshold. Whatever had been following them, whatever had been watching from the shadows, was no longer content to remain hidden. As they stepped into the chamber, the temperature plummeted and the air grew impossibly thick. Marcus felt a sharp pain in his chest, like a hand squeezing his heart. He gasped, struggling to catch his breath. Then, all at once, The lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed them, thicker than any night they had ever known. The only sound was their own breathing, ragged and panicked. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight, but when he turned it on, it barely flickered, casting only a dim, sputtering light. Clara's headlamp was the same, its glow weak and failing. "Something's wrong with the gear," David whispered, his voice shaking. But before Marcus could respond, the darkness seemed to shift. Shapes moved in the shadows, just beyond the reach of their failing lights. A soft whisper echoed through the chamber, a voice, ancient and unintelligible, yet somehow familiar. It sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Then came the footsteps again. Slow, deliberate, closer. They weren't alone anymore. The footsteps echoed through the suffocating darkness, each slow, deliberate step sending a wave of dread through Marcus, Clara, and David. They were frozen, unable to speak, barely able to breathe as their eyes strained against the blackness. The lights from their flashlights and headlamps flickered weakly, casting only brief, sputtering glows as if the very air around them was devouring the light. Marcus clenched his fist tightly around the flashlight, his knuckles white. He wasn't one to panic, but the oppressive atmosphere in the chamber was suffocating. The walls felt as though they were closing in, and the footsteps, they weren't random. Whatever was making them was coming closer, with intent. "Do you hear that?" David's voice was barely a whisper, laced with fear. His camera hung limply at his side, forgotten for the moment. "It's right behind us." Clara didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes wide, darting from side to side as though she could catch a glimpse of the unseen figure in the dark. But there was nothing, only shifting shadows and that terrible, slow rhythm of steps. Then, as abruptly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence pressed down on them, thicker and heavier than before. The chamber was impossibly still, the weight of centuries of secrets hanging in the air. Marcus' mind raced. Whatever was following them, it was watching now, waiting. "We have to keep moving," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. He pointed the dim beam of his flashlight toward the far end of the chamber, where the walls seemed to curve into yet another tunnel. They hadn't come all this way to turn back now, not when they were so close to uncovering whatever lay hidden in the depths of the catacombs. Clara shook her head, but her legs moved almost mechanically, carrying her forward as though something else had taken hold of her. Marcus and David followed closely behind, their steps quiet, cautious. The tunnel ahead was narrow, the walls slick with moisture and covered in patches of crumbling stone. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic and old. The deeper they went, the more disorienting the tunnel became. It twisted and turned in ways that didn't match the map Clara had studied so carefully. The walls seemed to shift, the ground uneven beneath their feet, as if the very structure of the catacombs was shifting around them, trapping them in a maze with no way out. David was the first to stumble. His foot caught on something, sending him crashing to the ground with a sharp grunt. "What the muh?" Marcus hurried to help him up, shining his light on the ground. Beneath David's foot lay a pile of bones, but these were different from the ones they had passed earlier. These weren't neatly arranged in the haunting displays the catacombs were known for. They were scattered, broken, as though something had disturbed them recently. David winced as he stood, brushing himself off. "This place is falling apart," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. He glanced at the bones again, unease flickering in his eyes. "We need to get out of here," Clara said suddenly, her voice cracking. She looked back down the tunnel they had just come from, but the darkness was impenetrable now, as though the path behind them had simply disappeared. "This isn't right. None of this is right." Marcus agreed, though he didn't say it out loud. He couldn't let panic set in. "We're too far in. Let's find the next chamber," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Maybe we missed something. Clara didn't argue, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. They pressed on, moving faster now, as though the very walls were chasing them. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the flickering light of their flashlights casting long, distorted shadows that twisted unnaturally against the stone. It was as if the catacombs themselves were alive, watching their every move. Then, up ahead, the tunnel opened into another chamber. But this one was different from the others. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols etched into the stone in patterns that Marcus couldn't recognize. They weren't like the historical markings or graffiti they had seen earlier. These were older, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, cracked and worn with age, surrounded by scattered bones and relics that had been untouched for centuries. Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on the carvings. "This is it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "This is what I was looking for." The air in the chamber was cold, colder than it had been in the tunnels, and it carried a sense of foreboding that settled deep in Marcus' chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a creeping feeling of dread washed over him. Something was wrong. David raised his camera, but the moment he did, the lens cracked with a sharp snap. He cursed, lowering it quickly. "What the—" Before he could finish, a sudden, piercing sound echoed through the chamber, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound cut through them like a knife, making Marcus' skin crawl. "What is that?" Clara gasped, stepping back toward Marcus. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Marcus couldn't answer. His heart raced in his chest as the wail grew louder, more deafening, until it became impossible to think. The sound wasn't coming from anything visible. There was no source, no explanation. It was as though the walls themselves were screaming, the catacombs finally revealing the horror that lay within them. "We have to go. Now!" Marcus shouted, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her toward the tunnel they had just come from. But as they turned, they saw it. A figure, barely visible in the flickering light of their failing flashlights, stood at the far end of the chamber. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its form was twisted, shadowy, as though it was part of the darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could be called that, gleamed faintly, reflecting the light like some predatory animal. It didn't move, but the pressure in the air around them grew heavier, suffocating. The wail faded, replaced by the sound of ragged breathing close, too close. Marcus took a step back, his body trembling with fear he hadn't felt in years. His mind screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Clara was paralyzed beside him, staring in horror at the figure as it slowly, impossibly, began to dissolve into the darkness. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. It was as though the world itself had stopped. Marcus felt the weight lift from his chest, but the terror remained. What was that? David's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. "We need to leave," Clara said, her voice shaking as she took another step back. Now, Marcus didn't argue. He knew, deep down, that whatever they had seen wasn't going to let them leave easily. Without another word, they turned and fled back into the tunnel, the chamber behind them disappearing into the blackness as quickly as it had appeared. And somewhere in the distance, the footsteps began again. The footsteps were relentless now, growing louder with every passing second, their cadence erratic yet purposeful. It was no longer the slow, measured rhythm they had heard before. It was faster, more urgent, as though whatever was chasing them was no longer content to watch from the shadows. Marcus led the way, his breathing ragged as they hurtled through the twisting tunnels. The cold, damp air burned in his lungs, and every step seemed to drive him deeper into the maze of bones and stone. Clara was just behind him, her hand gripping his arm as they ran. her wide eyes darting between the darkness ahead and the tunnel behind them, where the faint echoes of footsteps kept pace. David lagged slightly, the camera now forgotten in his desperate attempt to keep up. "We're going in circles." Clara's voice was a ragged gasp as they turned another corner, only to find a wall of skulls that looked far too familiar. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Marcus caught her by the arm and pulled her along. The map she'd been so careful to study was useless now. None of the paths made sense. Every tunnel they took seemed to lead them right back to where they had started, the twisted layout of the catacombs warping around them. Marcus didn't respond. He knew she was right, but the fear clawing at the back of his mind told him one thing: stopping was worse. They couldn't stop, not with whatever it was so close behind. David stumbled again, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. "We can't keep this up. We'll get lost for good," he panted. But even as he spoke, he knew they were already lost. The sound of the footsteps behind them grew louder, closer, now accompanied by something else. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a low, guttural murmur, barely audible beneath the pounding of their hearts. The words, if they were words at all, were in a language none of them could understand, but the malevolence in the sound was unmistakable. It seemed to wrap around them, pulling at their sanity with invisible claws. "We have to find another way out." Marcus's voice cracked with desperation as they turned another corner, plunging deeper into the catacombs. His flashlight flickered again, the weak beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. He felt as though the air itself was turning against them, thickening around them, making every breath a struggle. Suddenly, Clara yanked on his arm, pulling him toward a narrow opening in the wall that they had almost passed. "Here!" she cried, her voice tight with fear. Without waiting for a response, she ducked through the opening, squeezing her way into a narrow side tunnel. Marcus followed, his shoulders brushing against the rough stone walls as he wedged himself into the passage. David was close behind, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he squeezed through the tight space. The tunnel was cramped and uneven, forcing them to hunch over as they moved, but the sound of the footsteps behind them faded slightly, muffled by the narrow walls. Marcus let out a shaky breath, but he knew better than to believe they were safe. Not yet. As they made their way through the tunnel, Clara slowed, her breathing heavy and erratic. "This isn't right," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "None of this is right. It's like the catacombs are alive. They're changing." Marcus glanced at her, his brow furrowed in confusion, but he didn't have the energy to argue. The thought had crossed his mind more than once, the way the tunnels seemed to twist and turn, leading them back to where they started, as though they were being toyed with by some unseen force. But he couldn't let himself believe that. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The tunnel abruptly opened into another chamber, much smaller than the others they had seen, but still lined with bones. These bones, however, were different. They were piled haphazardly in the center of the room, not arranged in the careful patterns they had come to expect. The sight was disturbing, as though someone or something had been here recently, rifling through the remains. Clara stepped forward cautiously, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. "What is this place?" she whispered, but there was no answer. David, his face pale and glistening with sweat, leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. "I don't care what it is," he muttered. "We need to keep moving." But before any of them could take another step, the murmuring sound returned, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere deep within the catacombs, echoing off the walls, but it was impossible to tell from which direction. The words were still unintelligible, but the feeling they evoked was clear. Whatever was speaking was angry, furious. Then, without warning, the pile of bones in the center of the chamber shifted. Clara gasped, stumbling back as the bones began to move, slowly at first, as though being pushed by some unseen force. But then they moved faster, rattling and shifting, until they were swirling in a chaotic spiral. Marcus stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest as the bones rose into the air, twisting and turning in impossible directions. "What the hell is happening?" David cried, his voice breaking as he stared in horror at the spectacle before them. His flashlight flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into near total darkness. Only Clara's headlamp remained, casting a weak, trembling light over the scene. The bones swirled faster now, forming a tornado of skulls and limbs that rattled against the walls. The murmuring grew louder, more insistent, as though it was commanding the bones to move, to rise, to become something more. Then, with a deafening crash, the bones collapsed back onto the floor, the sound reverberating through the chamber. The murmuring stopped, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the group as they stared at the pile of bones, waiting for whatever had caused the disturbance to reveal itself. But nothing happened. "We need to get out of here," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. Now, Marcus didn't argue. He turned toward the tunnel they had come from, but something stopped him. A cold, creeping sensation crawled up his spine, and he knew, without looking, that they were no longer alone. Slowly, he turned back to the chamber, his eyes scanning the shadows. And there, at the far end of the room, something moved. It was just a shadow at first, barely discernible in the dim light. But then it stepped forward, revealing a figure cloaked in darkness. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. Its face was hidden, but its eyes, those eyes, gleamed in the faint light, piercing through the gloom with an eerie, predatory glow. The figure didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the temperature dropped even further, the cold biting into their skin. Marcus took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own fear. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled toward the tunnel, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. David followed, stumbling as he ran, his camera forgotten in his haste to escape. But Marcus hesitated, his eyes locked on the figure. There was something about it, something that told him this wasn't over, that even if they escaped this chamber, whatever was following them would still be there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its moment. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though acknowledging his thoughts. Then, slowly, it began to move toward him. That was all it took. Marcus turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears as he raced after Clara and David, the sound of his footsteps blending with the echo of the thing behind him. The catacombs weren't just a place anymore. They were alive, and they were angry. And they weren't going to let them leave without a fight. Marcus' footsteps echoed through the narrow tunnel as he raced forward, his mind a blur of panic and dread. Behind him, the ominous presence of the figure seemed to press closer, suffocating him with its cold, heavy aura. The catacombs had become a labyrinth of terror, each turn leading them deeper into the darkness. But running felt futile. No matter how fast or far they fled, the shadows always seemed to close in. Ahead, Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself forward, the dim glow of her headlamp flickering weakly in the oppressive blackness. David stumbled beside her, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with the same fear that gripped Marcus. The catacombs were no longer just a maze of bones and stone. They were something far more sinister, a force that had twisted reality into a living nightmare. "We can't keep going like this," David cried, his voice breaking through the deafening silence of the tunnels. "It's like we're running in circles." Marcus knew he was right. He had felt it too, the disorienting sensation that they were being led, funneled into some deeper, darker part of the catacombs where escape would be impossible. But what choice did they have? The thing chasing them wasn't going to stop, and neither could they. Up ahead, the tunnel split into two paths. Clara hesitated, glancing back at Marcus with wild eyes, silently begging for direction. But there was no way to know which way was right. The map had long since become useless, and the tunnels twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. Marcus swallowed hard, his throat dry with fear. "We'll take the left," he said, forcing the words out. It wasn't a choice based on reason, just instinct, a desperate hope that somehow it would lead them away from the nightmare pursuing them. Clara nodded, and without another word, they veered left, plunging into yet another narrow passageway. The air was colder here, the walls closing in tighter around them, and the silence that followed them was deafening. Marcus could still feel it, though the presence. It lingered just behind the veil of darkness, always watching, always waiting. The tunnel led them into a small chamber, one that seemed slightly different from the others they had passed through. The ceiling was lower here, the walls closer, and the arrangement of bones felt deliberate. Neat rows of skulls lined the walls, staring back at them with hollow, empty eyes, and the ground beneath their feet was slick with moisture. "We have to stop," Clara gasped, leaning against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. "Just for a minute. I can't keep going." Marcus hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to keep moving, but the look on Clara's face, pale, drenched in sweat, told him they couldn't push much further. They were nearing their limit. He glanced at David, who was hunched over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. "All right," Marcus said, though his voice was tight with unease. "But just for a minute." They stood in the center of the chamber, the silence around them thick and oppressive. Marcus' flashlight flickered weakly, and he hit it against his palm, trying to coax more life from the failing batteries. The beam brightened for a moment, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but it wasn't enough to push back the overwhelming darkness that pressed in on all sides. Clara slid down to the floor, her back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. Her eyes darted around the chamber, never lingering too long on any one spot, as if she was afraid of what she might see if she stared too hard. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's chasing us?" Marcus didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure there was an answer. Whatever it wasn't something he could explain with reason or logic. It wasn't just a ghost or an apparition. It was something older, darker, something tied to the very foundations of the catacombs themselves. The catacombs weren't just a burial site. They were a trap, a place where the past bled into the present, where the dead were never truly at rest. David, still catching his breath, sank down beside Clara. He was shaking, though he tried to hide it. "We can't stay here. It's going to find us." Marcus knew he was right. Whatever was hunting them, it wasn't far behind. And now they were trapped, backed into a corner in a chamber that felt more like a tomb with every passing second. Then, from the darkness of the tunnel they had come from, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The echo of each step sent a wave of dread through Marcus' body, and he stiffened, his muscles tensing as his heart pounded in his chest. "It's here," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the approaching footsteps. Marcus' mind raced. There was no other exit, no other tunnel to flee into. They were trapped, and whatever was coming for them was closing in fast. He could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on him, the air growing colder, thicker, with every step it took. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, just outside the chamber. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then, a whisper of voice so soft and so low that Marcus could barely hear it, but he knew it was speaking to him, directly to him. It was the same murmuring voice they had heard before, but now it was clear, distinct. It wasn't speaking in a language Marcus recognized, but somehow he understood the meaning. It was calling them, calling him. "Come," it said, the word curling around him like a cold breath. "Come deeper." Marcus' pulse quickened, his mind screaming at him to resist, to fight. But something about the voice was seductive, pulling at him with a force he couldn't explain. His legs felt heavy, as though they were no longer under his control, and he took an involuntary step forward. "Marcus!" Clara's voice cut through the fog in his mind, sharp and desperate. She reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "What are you doing?" The spell broke, and Marcus stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He blinked, disoriented, the chamber spinning around him for a moment before he regained his senses. "We have to go," David said, his voice shaking as he stood, glancing nervously toward the tunnel. "Now." Marcus didn't argue this time. Without another word, he grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her to her feet, and together they ran toward the other end of the chamber. The walls seemed to close in around them as they moved, the catacombs twisting and warping in ways that defied logic. It felt like the tunnels themselves were trying to trap them, to drag them deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, Marcus stumbled, his foot catching on something buried beneath the dirt. He fell hard, his flashlight tumbling from his hand and skittering across the ground. Pain shot through his knee, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, reaching for his flashlight. But as his fingers brushed the metal casing, something cold and sharp wrapped around his wrist. He gasped, jerking his hand back, but the grip tightened, pulling him down. Marcus' heart raced as he looked up, his eyes locking onto the source of the grip. A hand pale, skeletal, and impossibly strong was reaching out from the ground, its bony fingers wrapped tightly around his wrist. Marcus struggled, kicking and thrashing as he tried to free himself, but the hand pulled harder, dragging him closer to the ground. The dirt shifted beneath him, and Marcus realized with horror that more hands were emerging from the earth, their skeletal fingers grasping at his legs, his arms, pulling him down into the depths. "Help!" Marcus screamed, his voice raw with terror. Clara and David rushed to his side, grabbing his arms and pulling with all their strength. But the hands kept pulling, dragging him down into the darkness, their grip cold and unrelenting. For a moment, Marcus thought it was over. He could feel the ground opening up beneath him, pulling him into the catacombs' final, eternal embrace. But then, with one final, desperate tug, Clara and David yanked him free. The hands disappeared as quickly as they had come, leaving nothing but disturbed earth and a cold, hollow silence. Marcus lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. His body ached, and his mind reeled from the terror of what had just happened. But there was no time to recover. The presence, the thing that had been chasing them, was still there, waiting in the darkness. "Let's go," Clara said, her voice shaking as she helped Marcus to his feet. "We can't stay here." With trembling legs, Marcus stood, and together they fled deeper into the catacombs, the darkness closing in behind them. The whispers followed,